Good morning and welcome to the 7th meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2026. The first item on our agenda today is subordinate legislation which has been considered under the negative procedure. This is the Qualifications Scotland Strategic Advisory Council Establishment Regulations 2026. Do members have any comments on this instrument? No. Is the committee agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? That is agreed. Thank you. Our next item on the agenda today is Day 3 of Stage 2 proceedings for the Children, Care Experience and Services Planning Scotland Bill. Again, I welcome the Minister for Children, Young People and the Promise, who's here for this item along with her supporting officials. And I again remind members that the officials seated at the table are here to support the Minister but are not able to speak in the debates on amendments. Members should therefore direct their comments or questions to the Minister. And once again, during this meeting, we're welcoming a number of non-committee members who are attending to speak to their amendments and to participate in the debates. So we move now on to our next group, and I call Amendment 207 in the name of Miles Briggs. Group with amendments as shown in the groupings. Miles Briggs to move Amendment 207 and speak to all amendments in the group. Mr Briggs.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister, your officials, colleagues. I will try to be as brief as I can, but I'm not sure. I've got three amendments, Amendment 207, 208 and 210, which are all interlinked. And these amendments specifically look towards help make sure that opportunities to explore voluntary arrangements through family group decision-making are properly and consistently accounted for. And I very much welcome the acknowledgement from the Minister around family group decision-making and looking towards how that can be strengthened within the bill, which I know was part of cross-party asks. And this builds, I think, what very much should be in the promise. And the promise did say that family group decision-making should become a more common part of decision-making. The Hearings and Children's Report said that family group decision-making should be routinely and consistently offered to children and families in line with the national standards produced by the National Family Group Decision-Making Steering Group as an option to help find innovative and creative ways to solve their problems well in advance of any statutory involvement of a children's hearing system and in line with the recommendations in the promise. Amendment 207 and 208 specifically has a purpose of these amendments to establish a clear and consistent check on whether family group decision-making has been explored to inform the reporter's investigation and decision. And it is not about the reporter offering this service to families directly. This Amendment 208 would not prevent or delay hearings, therefore. It is a right thing for the child, therefore, that this is an offer made, and it would help to make sure that this is properly considered either before or alongside the hearing system. Amendment 210 is specifically around reporting on family group decision making and would establish a better understanding of how and when children and families are being offered family group decision making across Scotland to inform policy and resources and resourcing decisions to help meet the promise's call. I know as an Edinburgh MSP, Edinburgh City Council's work around this is really transforming lives and making a real difference, as I know is the case in Glasgow. But I think there's a real opportunity for us to strengthen family group decision-making as part of the bill. And I move Amendment 207 in my name.
Thank you very much. I call Martin Whitfield to speak to Amendment 208A and other amendments in the group. Mr Whitfield.
Good morning, Convener, and to the committee. And can I just remind those within the room and watching of my declaration of interests. This group, I don't intend to speak too long because I think Miles has introduced it exceptionally well, and it is about ensuring the best for individual children through which family group decision-making can make such a transformative change. The amendments that I have brought in this section 28A seek to add to 208 in respect of considering whether the actual offer of family group be offered, and it's an extension to require the reporter to consider that in appropriate cases. And 210A really just seeks to add some specificity to the reports produced under Amendment 210 in Miles Briggs' name, which I support. I think we have an opportunity here to bring within this legislation something that really should have been there from the outset. From the original promise, it has been seen as a way of ensuring the best environment in which to discuss challenges and promises, but also to find solutions which are there. So I welcome, as Miles Briggs has done, the move from the Scottish Government to see where we are on it, but I think it will put a crucial, important and timely intervention into the bill which will assist. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And I call Ros McCall to speak to Amendment 118 and other amendments in the group. Ms McCall.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak to Amendments 118, 211 and 125. These amendments introduce national standards, guidance and reporting requirements for family group decision-making, a cornerstone of early intervention and family-centred practice. Family group decision-making recognises that children do best when families are engaged in the decision-making about their care and support, with professionals acting as facilitators rather than directors of their lives. So Amendment 118 requires Scottish ministers to establish national standards of practice guidance for family group decision-making, and this ensures consistency, quality and accountability across all local authorities and third sector providers. By requiring consultation with stakeholders, including the National Steering Group, local authorities, third sector providers, the Principal Reporter and the National Convener, this amendment ensures that guidance is practical, informed by experience and child-centred. Amendment 211 requires Scottish ministers to produce a report on family group decision-making provision and sustainability within 1 year of royal assent, which must be published and laid before Parliament. This creates transparency, allowing monitoring of the implementation of this. And Amendment 125 updates Section 24 to explicitly reference this part, ensuring that family group decision-making is fully integrated into the legislative framework of the Children's Hearing System. And that's my amendments. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And I call Willie Rennie to speak to Amendment 212 and other amendments in the group. Mr Rennie.
So my amendments are 212, 213, 214 and 215. I've been working with Children First on this, who've been very supportive, and I know they've been working constructively also with the Minister about perhaps making amendments at stage 3. But I want to introduce these amendments to put down an early discussion about these issues to make sure that we do get to the right place at stage 3. So my 212 would establish statutory guidance to help areas across Scotland deliver high quality and consistent family group decision-making services. It would build on work already done by the third sector and local authority providers and gives this more profile and greater authority. It mirrors 118 from Ros McCall, but goes further in a number of crucial ways. In particular, it specifies a few key points in decision-making processes that are not set out in legislation, where evidence shows that family group decision-making can have a real impact. That includes pre-birth assessments, when children are being considered at child protection case conferences, and, finally, when there are plans to return a child to their family or leave secure or residential care. The promise is quite clear about family group decision-making. It says it must be of high quality and there must be an approach on developing or further developing consistent standards and training as in other areas such as advocacy. And then it also says, the Promise Oversight Board also says there is a need to ensure it is available to everyone who would benefit from wherever they live in Scotland, and it is substantially funded. Now, my next amendment, 213, the intention behind this amendment is to establish a clear legislative duty to provide that family group decision-making services. It seeks to address two issues. One, patchy provision. We know that around 2/3 of local authorities already have some form, to varying degrees, of service available. This leaves around 1/3 without an offer, and Children's First research shows that there are many areas where the service operates in small teams and is vulnerable to cuts. And secondly, the law is unclear. Children First also commissioned a legal opinion by Janice Scott KC, which also showed that the current law isn't clear enough about local authorities' responsibility to provide these services. This amendment could also work alongside the new statutory guidance already debated and help services build up towards consistent, high-quality provision available to every child equally across Scotland. 214, that amendment seeks to introduce a duty to promote family group decision-making, which would require local authorities to take reasonable steps to make families aware of these services and the benefits that they might have. The purpose is to help local authorities promote an approach grounded in early help and prevention. We know that many children and families struggle to find help unless they are experiencing a level of crisis. They need help to reach a high threshold to qualify for help or be referred to services like family group decision-making. This amendment would help turn that around. If families know about services like this, then there is a higher chance that they make use of them at an earlier possible stage. This, in turn, should help prevent problems building up. Now, I recognise that this might lead to a higher level of demand, which in turn might need further resource. However, helping families to resolve their challenges at an earlier stage should help make savings in the long run. In England, a mandatory offer of family group decision-making before court proceedings is currently being legislated for through the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill. This means that all families will be offered that family group decision-making before court proceedings, so that, where possible, they can be supported to develop their own solutions without relying on a system of intervention. This amendment has a similar ethos. Amendment 215, finally, is consequent, and its consequential amendment 223 followed the same ethos in 214, which seeks to empower families as far as possible to access family group decision-making services in a way and at a time that is right for them. The promise talks about Scotland's commitment to early intervention and prevention, but a combination of national crisis alongside slow system reform means that we're a long way from keeping the promise and making that transition. Families need to be empowered and supported to access services. There should always be a way to find support before statutory interventions are brought in. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And I call the Minister.
Convener, and I thank all members for what I think has been a really constructive approach to consideration of including family group decision making to this bill, both during stage 1 scrutiny and during in stage 2 amendments, I should say. The Government agrees that it is important to see family group decision making clearly reflected on the face of the bill, and I do support the intention of a number of amendments which seek to strengthen family group decision making practice to encourage consistent, proportionate and targeted support that best serves the interests of children and families. Now, the Government will support certain amendments today, and I ask that we work together in advance of stage 3. Family group decision-making, as we know, can play a really powerful role in supporting children and families. When it is used appropriately, it brings families together, it supports children to be heard, and it enables wider family networks to be part of planning and part of decision-making. That can help build stronger, more sustainable plans, support earlier and more preventative intervention, and of course reduce the need for escalation. Family group decision-making is not intended to be a mandatory step, but an option to be considered within a wider GURFEC-based approach, informed, of course, by the professional judgment of social workers and other practitioners, and tailored to the individual circumstances of each child. Family group decision-making has a very important role to play within the suite of early interventions available to support families. However, it might not always be the most appropriate tool, particularly in cases where there is coercive control, domestic abuse or other risk factors within a child's life. With that in mind, I cannot support Amendments 208 and 208A. These amendments risk creating a mandatory process, moving away from the voluntary and supportive role of family group decision-making, and confer duties on the Children's Reporter, which more appropriately belong to local authorities. But as members have pointed out, engagement has been taking place with Children First on stage 3 amendments, as well as with members across the Parliament, and we're in agreement on the intent of many of the amendments lodged. So it's my intention to continue to work with Children First as we develop targeted measures designed to strengthen both practice and strategic oversight while supporting effective decision-making across the wider system. I will bring the results of this work forward at stage 3 for a package that, inclusive of what is passed here today and the product of further discussion with Children First and members, I'm confident that members will be supportive of. Considering this work, I invite members to support amendments 207, 210, 210A and 212 and to work with me on refinements to bring forward at stage 3. In light of the Government's position, I'm asking other members not to press their other amendments today because, as I say, I'm really keen to continue these fruitful discussions ahead of stage 3 with a view to developing a coherent and workable package that reflects our shared ambition in relation to family group decision making. I was finished, Mr Rainey, but...
Could the Minister just clarify which ones that she's prepared to support today?
Minister.
Yes, just to reiterate, 207, 210, 210A and 212.
And in terms of...
Willie Rennie.
Is there any of the purposes of my amendments, not the detail, because I know we want to have further discussions before stage 3, is there anything in my amendments that she objects to in principle, as I've set out today, in terms of promoting advocacy, the statutory guidance, etc.?
Not in terms of promoting. Not in terms of promoting. I agree with that wholeheartedly. That we perhaps need to do more on that front to make families aware, because, as I say, that can be a really important process. However, in terms of the duties on the principal reporter and the shift away from the duties of the principal reporter as it currently stands, that is where the issue remains. That's where I continue to, as I say, I would like to continue having discussions with Children First in relation to that and other members.
Okay, thank you.
And you're now concluded, Minister.
Yes, I have.
Thank you. I call on Miles Briggs to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 207. Mr Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. I think listening to colleagues, it's quite clear with the breadth of cross-party amendments that this is something which I think we can really strengthen at stage 3, and it really does present a great future model of support and early intervention. So I hope we can make sure that's achieved at stage 3. I'm happy to take the Minister's assurances. Amendments which the Government are supporting will, of course, now include this is part of stage 2. So I think there's an opportunity for us really to get this right collectively at stage 3. And so I'll move 207 in my name.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 207 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. I call Amendment 208 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 207. Miles Briggs to move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you. I call Amendment 116 in the name of Sue Webber, already debated with Amendment 50. Miles Briggs to move or not move?
Move.
116 is moved. The question is that Amendment 116 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 116? Thank you. And those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 116 is yes 3, no 7. Amendment 116 is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 199 in the name of Martin Whitfield, already debated with Amendment 110. Martin Whitfield to move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you very much. I now call Amendment 209 in the name of Willie Rennie in a group of its own. Willie Rennie to move and speak to Amendment 209. Mr Rennie.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. So this is about places of safety. Amendment 209. The amendment allows for children to be taken to places of safety as defined in the Children's Hearing Act. Children can already be taken to places of safety between being charged and going to court, but this amendment allows that to take place earlier in the process. The amendment was developed in response to a suggestion by the Children and Young People's Centre for Justice. Children who come into conflict with the law are overwhelmingly from disadvantaged backgrounds, many of whom have suffered adverse childhood experiences. The Independent Care Review also identified For a variety of reasons, care-experienced children are disproportionately criminalised. An inspection of police custody in March 2025 found children being held for disproportionate lengths of time, including a 13-year-old for 6 hours and a 14-year-old for 12 hours. Children and young people have told the CYCJ that custody can be re-traumatising and is often the most difficult part of their justice journey. The committee will recall that the CYCJ evidence submission, in which they said that they welcome the ongoing work across Scotland to look at alternatives to police custody, including the use of places of safety. However, in accordance with Section 4 of the Criminal Justice Scotland Act 2016, Police Scotland are still required to take an arrested person, regardless of age, to a police station. The small chance to this legislation proposed in this amendment would allow for a child to be taken instead to an appropriate place of safety, where this is possible. The proposed change in legislation would therefore provide options to be creative, person-centred and more trauma-informed, but would also allow for sufficient time for the establishment of provisions and resources to become embedded across Scotland.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Convener, and I thank Mr Rainey for Amendment 209 and for raising this important matter, and I do support the intention behind the amendment. We've already taken significant steps through the Children, Care and Justice Scotland Act 2024 to achieve this. Once commenced on the 30th of March, the Act will ensure that the default position for all under 18s who have been charged with an offence is to be taken to a place of safety other than a police station prior to their appearance at court. And there's broad agreement that police custody is not an appropriate environment for children, but the implications of changing this are truly complex. There's an established working group currently considering the broader opportunities and the challenges around building in flexibility on the use of alternatives to a police station. And we continue to work very closely with partners, and Police Scotland are already progressing non-legislative improvements, such as expanding voluntary interview pathways and developing child-friendly approaches within existing stations. But I do agree we need to go further, and we need to explore how we can ensure that taking a child to a police station on arrest is not the usual practice in the future. But I am conscious that careful consideration needs to be given to a test to be applied when deciding that an alternative location is suitable to receive the child, and indeed to where that location might be. The definition of a place of safety in the Children's Hearing Scotland Act 2011 includes a range of places such as a residential care home, a hospital or someone's house. Understandably, Police Scotland are clear that they need to be able to perform their role in appropriate settings which best meet the needs of the children, and that they need to have appropriate powers to keep those children safe. So I think it would be, on top of the work that's already underway, I think it would be sensible to take more time to explore Police Scotland's views and others' views on suitable settings and practicalities before making changes to the law in this area, so that we can be confident that any changes or any legislative amendments are workable in practice. Yes.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for taking the intervention. Is the challenge not that, and this is not being in any way disrespectful to Police Scotland, that the current process will always be the easiest one for a current provider to continue to do? And what this amendment suggests, and what I think needs to happen, is to shift the argument to say, effectively, the last place of resort would be a police station and everything else needs to take place. And I accept the Minister's very articulate discussion about the group that's meeting, but is it not more fundamentally flipping that question over, so to challenge Police Scotland why they can't facilitate either at a hospital or a house for events? And I realise that critically difficult times are going to be weekends and evenings, and so it becomes an absolute exception that a police station is used. If that's the case, how long does the Minister envisage it taking to reach that position?
Minister.
I couldn't put a timescale on that. I think Mr Whitfield really effectively highlights some of the challenges that revolve around this. I think, you know, when you said that when Mr Whitfield said that the police station should become the last resort, yes, I agree, but there are real differences, I think, and difficulties. You know, while we're talking about in relation to children being taken to a place of safety before court, there may, within those places, they may be appropriate for holding a child before court, but not necessarily before at the point of arrest, where there are very different circumstances and could be real complexities. So I think that automatically becomes a challenge. There are also other questions around this, for example, how the decision would be reached for a place of safety. Would that be a multi-agency decision? Would that purely be on Police Scotland? What commanding officer would make that decision? What rank would that be? So I think I can't put a timescale on that. I think we've had a debate on the real complexities here. As I say, I know there's been work underway with this, but I would like that work to continue, because I think that we do have to get to the point that Mr Whitfield talks about. But as I say, there are a number of issues in getting there. So I'll sum up. I don't need to say much more, but I would really stress that I am supportive of the intention behind this amendment. I'm sorry, was Mr Briggs looking to come
Miles
in?
Briggs.
Thank the Minister. You know, I've had a number of meetings with Police Scotland who, you know, are really frustrated that for adults, actually taking them in crisis to A&E, a mental health crisis, is the only option. So I think we have to be careful about what we then create as what we're classifying as a safe place without any real outcome attached to it, apart from a holding area. And I don't think it would be appropriate to then start filling A&E units with young people. So I just wondered, the Minister outlined some work going on. When is that likely to report, which would then present different models and alternatives? Because it sounds like we're not in a place to actually identify what would be classified as a safe place.
I don't have that information to hand, but what I can say is I was happy to continue discussions with Mr Rennie around this, and obviously I have a number of cross-party discussions set up in advance of stage 3, so I'd be more than happy to provide a little more information around that at that time, if that would be helpful. So in that light, I would ask Mr Rennie not to press his amendment pending further explorations and discussions, and as I've been clear, I'm happy to consider and take away ahead of stage 3 if that would be an appropriate time to do so.
Thank you. I call on Willie Rennie to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 209. Mr Rennie.
I want to thank Martin Whitfield and Miles Briggs for contributing to that debate. I think it helped just put a spotlight on some of the challenges that we face. And I won't move the amendment, but what I'm keen to understand from the Minister as to whether she could see the possible resolution of this in terms of a change to the law in stage 3, or does she see that work going beyond stage 3 and therefore into another bill, and in which case I know she's not in control of a future Parliament's legislative agenda, but would she consider it appropriate for this to be included in another piece of legislation? And then the final question I suppose I have for the Minister for consideration in advance of stage 3 is whether some of this work can be done without a change to the law, or is it the case that Police Scotland would require a change in the law before they could change their practice? I'm quite happy to take an intervention now if that's possible. Yeah. Minister.
Yes, so there was a number of questions there. In terms of timescales, as I say, if we could get something in at stage 3 that either defines this or points to further work or exploration, then I'd be happy to do so. But I will take advice on whether that is appropriate and whether, you know, some of the complexities we've just raised could be, or the safeguards could be there if there is anything at stage 3. In terms of would it be appropriate for other legislation? I think we've been clear. I've been very clear that I agree with the intent behind this amendment. So, you know, I would like to see this progressed further, whether that is in this Parliament or next. In relation to a change in the law, yes, a change in the law would be required. However, that doesn't take away the further work and the exploration that could go on prior to that point.
Willie Rennie.
And with that point, I'll conclude. Thank you.
And you're withdrawing?
I'm withdrawing.
Willie Rennie seeks to withdraw Amendment 209. Does any member object? No member objects, so Amendment 209 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 118 in the name of Ros McCall, already debated with Amendment 207. Ros McCall to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 210 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 207. Miles Briggs to move or not move?
Moved.
I call Amendment 210A. In the name of Martin Whitfield, already debated with Amendment 207. Martin Whitfield to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 210A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 210A? I'm about to close the vote. If there's any... OK, there we go, just before we get there. Yeah, no, I think we're 9-0, one abstention, but we... If you'd like me to call it again, that's... I'm going to guess that's going to be the outcome, but we'll try again. OK, so the question is that Amendment 210A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 210A? Thank you. Those against and those abstaining. Okay, thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 210A is yes 9, no 0. There was one abstention. Amendment 210A is therefore agreed to. I call on Miles Briggs to press or withdraw Amendment 210 as amended.
Moved.
OK, the question is that Amendment 210 as amended be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Yes. Oh, thank you very much. I call Amendment 211 in the name of Ros McCall, already debated with Amendment 207. Ros McCall to move or not move?
Not moved.
Okay. I call Amendment 212 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 207. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 212 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 213 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 207. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 214 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 207. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 215 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 207. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 81 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 82, 121 and 123. Minister to move Amendment 81 and speak to all amendments in the group. Minister.
Convener, my Amendment 82 updates Section 59A of the Public Service Reform Scotland Act 2010 to reflect changes that Section 22 of the Bill makes to the bodies which will be responsible for children's service planning in the future. Section 59A of the 2010 Act requires that where certain care services are applying for Care Inspectorate registration, they must give notice of their application in a prescribed form to those responsible for children's services planning in the area in which the new service is intended to operate. Amendment 82 updates Section 59A to reflect that. In future, any integration joint board which operates in the relevant area should be notified of the Care Inspectorate application, as well as the current local authorities and health boards. Amendment 81 is consequential to that. These are largely technical amendments, but with a purpose that I hope members can support. Now, I thank Ros McCall for her amendments 121 and 123 and for our discussion in advance of Stage 2. I do acknowledge the concerns around ongoing pressures on local areas. However, I feel strongly that the provision in Section 22 of the Bill will help us bridge the gap which we all know can exist between children's and adult services. We know that integrated working between children's and adult services is more likely to lead to improved outcomes for children and families. That will not come to an end, so it would be inappropriate to bring this provision to an end through a sunset clause. The IJB provision should not impact on current arrangements, since IJBs should already be involved in children's services planning as an other service provider. The provision merely strengthens an existing responsibility by driving culture change and improved collaboration, supporting a more coherent approach across children's and adult services and improved transitions for young people. Now, the journey of public sector reform that has just begun is likely to create more of a need for such integrated working in the future, not reduce it. I therefore don't think it would be helpful for longer term work to make this support for integration time limited. Integration joint boards play a key role in relation to adult services, which is pertinent for our aims for children leaving care and to be supported sometimes through continuing care or aftercare. IJBs should be expected to contribute through appropriate services to meet those needs. Other adult services, such as those for substance use, often have a direct impact on children. Strengthening the role of integration joint boards in all areas will address inconsistencies, improve whole family support and enhance transitions for young people moving between children's and adult services. I do agree that we need to make sure our strategic planning environment is operating as well as it can, and that we need to make sure this provision is making a positive difference. I think the right way to do that is to think about other amendments to be considered today in respect of reviewing this Act. I would therefore ask Ros McCall not to move for amendments 121 and 123 today, but to engage further with me to consider the effect, benefit and the challenges of the change being made through section 22 of the bill. If she does move these amendments, I would encourage members to vote against them. I hope members will support my amendments, and I move Amendment 81.
Thank you. I call Ros McCall to speak to Amendment 121 and other amendments in the group. Ms McCall.
Thank you, Convener. First of all, I'd like to thank the Minister for all the work we've done on this. As she's already highlighted, she knows my concerns on this. My concern is, and as much as I accept, I'm going to state categorically that I agree actually that we do need to blend the process between child services and adult services, and the IJB is the best place to do that. But my concerns over IJBs are pretty much that most of them, right the way across the country, are financially struggling right now with the current responsibilities that they have. And adding more with the limited resources is worrying, especially how important this is. So my amendments require the Scottish Minister to review the operation and effectiveness of this function conferred on our integration joint boards and to lay a report before Parliament. Embedding transparency allows the Parliament oversight and provides an opportunity for us to adjust the practice based on evidence and experience over that time. By including a formal review, we ensure that any continuation of new arrangements is supported by clear evidence and that they come with the benefit of children, reducing fragmentation and improved outcomes. But I do take on board what the Minister has said today. I know I have concerns over this, and I am willing to work with the Minister for Stage 3 to see if we can come up with a different way of amending this to get to the suitable outcome. Because the blending of this is important, but if it is kicked down the line, if it is not engaged, or if the IJBs are not sufficiently resourced to be able to do it, we could find it just collapses at the first hurdle. And that's my main concern. So that's my amendments. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And I call on the Minister to wind up.
I think just reflecting on what Ms McCall said there, I would be concerned that the approach at the moment could lead to further inconsistencies later down the line. And what I think we should be looking at is the success of this, or how impactful it has been, and considering where it hasn't been, how to further support that to be more successful. So, again, I do recognise the intent behind it, and I think in relation to looking at further reviews of the Act or the provisions in the Act at a later group, that's something that can be considered in that light. So, as I say, happy to continue those discussions, and I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 81 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. I call Amendment 82 in the name of the Minister. Already debated with Amendment 81. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 82 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. The question is that Section 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. I call Amendment 83 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon, grouped with Amendments 84, 85, 122 and 216. I call on Nicola Sturgeon to move Amendment 83 and speak to all amendments in the group. Ms Sturgeon.
Amendments 83, 84 and 85 are prompted by a concern that I've had for a long time about a lack of consistency between local authorities on important issues of policy and sometimes practice. For example, use of restraint, sibling separation, exclusion from school. These are just some examples. Indeed, sometimes the inconsistency even relates to what data is gathered by different local authorities. So these amendments seek to resolve that, at least to some extent. They relate to the setting of national outcomes and priorities, reporting criteria and consultation in relation to children's services planning. Amendments 83 and 85 significantly strengthen children's services planning by providing Scottish ministers with regulation-making powers to ensure greater national consistency and oversight in relation to the aims of children's services plans, while of course retaining the flexibility for local lead children's services planning bodies to respond to their own local priorities. They also enhance accountability in relation to reporting on the achievement and implementation of those plans. The fact is, many, if not all, of the challenges facing children and families are shared across the country. Setting national outcomes, priorities and reporting criteria will help to focus effort on those challenges, or at the very least mean that they cannot be ignored. And this will help to develop a clearer, more consistent picture of how children's services planning partnerships are performing across the country, and hopefully avoid a postcode lottery of care. The benefits are twofold. First, the approach strengthens accountability by providing a more consistent basis on which plans in progress can be assessed. And second, it will help identify where support and improvement activity is most needed, allowing national and local partners to target resources more effectively. However, including a duty to consult in relation to the new powers ensures that stakeholders have a genuine chance to influence the national outcomes, priorities and reporting criteria, helping to make sure that these reflect their local issues and priorities. Turning briefly to Amendment 84, Scottish ministers and other service providers currently have the ability to dispute elements of a children's services plan by issuing a notice that sets out their reasons for disagreement. But currently the law doesn't require those preparing the plan to take any meaningful action in response to that notice. Amendment 84 addresses that gap by placing a clear requirement on those contributing to a plan to take concerns seriously and, crucially, to respond to them. This strengthens accountability, supports better collaboration and will help ensure plans genuinely reflect the needs of children and families. So for these reasons, I would strongly recommend that the committee supports these amendments, and I move Amendment 83 in my name.
Thank you. I call on Miles Briggs to speak to Amendment 122 in the name of Sue Webber and other amendments in the group. Mr Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. And I'll start by welcoming the amendments in Nicola Sturgeon's name. I think this set of amendments can really strengthen the children's services plans. And the Amendment 122 in my colleague Sue Webber's name specifically looks towards prevention around family separation. Now, there's currently no mention in the bill about reunification of children and parents and families. Parents have to fight often, fight hard to have their children returned to their care. And when children are unified, there's often very little support offered to these families. Children have the right to be brought up when it's safe to do so with their parents and families. But we need to make sure that the lack of support should not be a barrier to realising this, if that is what a child or young person wants as their outcome. So Amendment 122 adds a new aim for the children's services plans. These are services that allow a child to continue to resume living with their parent, and that must be available to the extent all children who need to access these services. And interested to hear what the Minister has to say with this, because I think the bill is missing work around reunification services. So I'll be interested to hear what she says later. Amendment 216 in my name. I've been working with Chaz specifically on this, and I think it's an important aspect of the bill, and I'd pay tribute to Chaz and what they do across Scotland. My amendment looks to ensure families with children, young people with life-shortening conditions get the support they need to transition into adult services. And I'd put on record my concerns, which Ros McCall have already outlined in relation to IJBs, and where potential aspects of this bill could be lost when IJBs have to decide what they're going to be funding going forward. So my Amendment 216 specifically looks to make sure that we see that consistent approach across Scotland to ensure that children and young people with life-shortening conditions really get the support they need in transitioning. And I move Amendment 122 in Sue Webber's name.
Thank you. Call the Minister.
Thank Nicola Sturgeon for bringing amendments 83 to 85 forward. Improved children's service planning is central to keeping the promise, and therefore I am very happy to support these amendments. These amendments will help achieve a better balance of strong national oversight on national priorities while giving local areas the flexibility that they need to deliver the best outcomes for children and families. They should also mean that there is better information locally and nationally to support the development of future priorities and plans. And Ms Sturgeon mentioned consistency, and that's something that has been absolutely key for me going forward, and something that I believe that these amendments can help to improve. But of course, any change needs to make things simpler and more effective and reduce process and administrative burden, not add to it. And these changes give time for consultation and to ensure that we get this right, as well as future-proofing the intent to cover the national priorities at that time. I thank Sue Webber for proposing Amendment 122, but I don't consider that it's needed. The existing statutory aims for children's services plans are broad and applicable to all children and young people, including those with specific types of needs, such as those who are care experienced. The aims already ensure that the well-being of all children is supported and promoted, that support is delivered as early as possible, and that best use is made of available resources. Broad aims allow for flexibility for local areas to respond to their specific population needs and allow that planning to take place in a holistic way. Given that every local authority has committed to keeping the promise, in reality, some of the sorts of services that might help keep children living safely in their family will already feature in how plans are developed and delivered. Amendment 216, in the name of Miles Briggs, seeks to address the complexity of the landscape surrounding transitions and the particular challenges that families with children with life-shortening conditions often experience. And this is exactly why we've included provision in the bill to strengthen the role of integration joint boards in children's service planning, to ensure that the relevant adult health and local authority services are obligated to consider how to support young adults. I do share Mr Briggs' ambitions to strengthen the accountability of local authorities and health boards in respect of their children's services plans, and the need for more consistent data to improve national oversight. That need, I think, can be better met through Nicola Sturgeon's Amendment 85 than through a separate reporting duty here. There is a need for more information about how transition is supported for disabled children moving into adulthood, and that would include children with life-shortening conditions. More generally, Amendments 83 and 85 would allow Scottish ministers to prescribe specific matters to be included in future children's services plans and annual reports, so the needs of specific groups of children, such as those with life-shortening conditions, can be made visible and addressed in local areas. Miles Briggs has brought attention to an important group of children through the debate on Amendment 216, but I hope that he would agree that the amendment is not necessary and will not press it. And if he does, I would encourage members to vote against. Similarly, I hope Sue Webber's Amendment 122 will not be pressed. Again, I would encourage members to vote against it. I support Nicola Sturgeon's Amendments 83, 84 and 85.
Thank you. I call on Nicola Sturgeon to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 83. Ms Sturgeon.
In light of the Minister's support, I've got nothing further to add, and I move Amendment 83.
The question is that Amendment 83 be agreed to. Are all agreed? That is agreed. I call Amendment 84 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon, already debated with Amendment 83. Nicola Sturgeon to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 84 be agreed to. Are all agreed? That is agreed. I call Amendment 85 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon, already debated with Amendment 83. Nicola Sturgeon to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 85 be agreed to. Are all agreed? That is agreed. I call Amendment 121 in the name of Ros McCall, already debated with Amendment 81. Ros McCall to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 122 in the name of Sue Webber, already debated with Amendment 83. Miles Briggs to move or not move? Amendment 122.
Yeah, I won't be moving, but I think it's an area, especially around reunification, I'd be interested to pursue alongside Sue Webber with the Minister in conversations, because I think it still is important that there has been voices to express that there isn't anything specifically in the bill around that to strengthen, but not moved.
Thank you.
Long way of saying it moved.
A very long way, but we allowed you some latitude with that. I call Amendment 216 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 83. Miles Briggs, to move or not move? I call Amendment 217 in the name of Martin Whitfield, already debated with Amendment 92. Martin Whitfield, to move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you very much. I call Amendment 218 in the name of Martin Whitfield, group with Amendments 219 and 220. Martin Whitfield, to move Amendment 218 and speak to all amendments in the group. Mr Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Convener, and this is the last group, which brings us to something which I am pleased to see appearing more frequently in legislation, which is a section on post-legislative scrutiny, in this case titled Review of the Act. My Amendment 218 explores the interesting idea of how involved and how can the Parliament be involved in post-legislative scrutiny, which is a recourse that's been gone to, I think, because sometimes there have been challenges put forward by the government in respect of post-legislative scrutiny, which I understand are as if the tide on the way out because of the importance of post-legislative scrutiny now being understood by all. So my proposal in 218 was to place a duty on the Scottish Parliament to arrange for one of its committees, and I say so quietly because clearly it would be the future of this committee that would probably have to pick it up in respect of looking at the bill. I think looking at all of the amendments that are contained in this group, there is a desire to see a review, and indeed the Minister has articulated today a number of other areas where reviews will be necessary. We, of course, have a deadline in respect of this legislation, which is 2030, so actually the pressure that exists within the promise which can be articulated in this bill, I think is both an important one and one that rightly requires a level of urgency, so that after a review, where if there are any disappointing evidence comes out from a review, there is still time to put it right. I'm more than happy to give way to John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I mean, it's interesting, this whole area of post-legislative scrutiny, and would you agree with me that one of the challenges is timing? Because if you do this too soon, there's not been enough time for new legislation to settle in and really take effect. But then if you do it too late, then it becomes kind of pointless. And, I mean, I note the dates that he's got in his amendment. Does he think they're the right dates, trying to get the balance in there?
Martin Whitfield.
Can I thank John Mason for that intervention? I think there are two levels with regard to his question. Generally, with regard to post-legislative scrutiny, doing it too early is a waste because you have no idea how it's been implemented. The second part of it is the challenge that we face in this legislation, that there is an agreed promise to be kept by 2030. And if we head down, even by accident, the wrong road, we will use up vital time that we are needed. So with regard to the time limits, I think they are important. I think they're driven because we have a deadline date for this, which doesn't necessarily exist in other legislation, but is incredibly important in this piece of legislation. And therefore we have to articulate the reviews with that in mind, because it would be pointless having a review in 2035. It may horrendously be an autopsy rather than a review. So there are pressures, and I think they exist in all of the amendments that are within this section. So I'll be interested to see from the Minister and other contributions where we can properly land so that this bill can be kept, so that the promise can be kept absolutely as it must be at the forefront of people's minds, but with the opportunity where if there are errors, omissions occurring, we identify those early and can rectify them before 2030. And I'll leave my contribution at that stage.
Thank you.
Motion.
Thank you. I call Ross Greer to speak to Amendment 219 and other amendments in the group. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Convener. I'll be brief because Mr Whitfield's already laid out the rationale for the need for a review. So I suppose this is a question of what kind of review are we looking for here, and can we reach some level of consensus at this stage, or, as I think is more likely, is there broad agreement at this stage on the need for a review, and perhaps we pass more than one of these amendments at this stage and then come back at stage 3 to resolve any potential differences. In terms of those differences, my 219 puts the onus to prepare, to conduct the review and to prepare a report on ministers rather than on Parliament. I do think there's an argument for both. I suppose I instinctively come at this in the position of being perfectly comfortable binding future governments, but less comfortable binding future parliaments on what they should and shouldn't do. But I'd be interested in colleagues' views on that. My 219 would require ministers to include in that report a statement about any further action they believe is necessary, subsequent to having completed the review, any further action that they believe is necessary to meet the promise. And in terms of timescales, which is what John Mason raised, I think 2 years is probably about the right timescale. I'd be slightly concerned with 18 months that some elements of this wouldn't have bedded in by that point, particularly given the difference between whatever the commencement date is and financial years. But again, we're in broadly the same territory, and I think I would hope there's broad consensus on the need for review, and it's just a question of exactly what direction we want to go down. So I'd be particularly interested to hear from the Minister. I think possibly the one significant difference is, do we put the requirement on ministers or on Parliament? But again, I'd be keen to hear from colleagues on that. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I call on Willie Rennie to speak to Amendment 220 and other amendments in the group. Mr Rennie.
Yeah, my amendment is broadly in the same area, and my amendment puts a requirement on the government to produce a report within 2 years. And I think the 2 years point is important because it would be roughly the midpoint of the next Parliament. It would be an important staging post for keeping the promise. And if we delay it any longer, I don't think we would have any traction from the outcome from those reports. But my report in particular would require, or my amendment would require, a report from the Scottish Government to provide key data on 3 important areas: to progress to eliminate the practice of restraint of children and young people in care, progress to eliminate the exclusion of care-experienced people from education, and longitudinal data on care-experienced adult outcomes. I've done this in partnership with Who Cares Scotland, who are concerned about keeping up the pressure on keeping the promise, and that's the purpose of my amendment.
Thank you. I call the Minister.
Thank you. I thank the 3 members for bringing forward their respective amendments. I think each amendment appropriately recognises the importance of ensuring that the legislative change that's going to be introduced through, or is being introduced through the bill, is both implemented and impactful in the manner that it's intended. And I do both understand and agree with the aim to ensure that the intentions are delivering on their purpose. While I agree with the importance of transparent reporting on progress towards keeping the promise, these amendments risk introducing duplicative and potentially conflicting statutory reporting requirements alongside existing and planned reporting frameworks. So Amendment 219 from Mr Greer and Amendment 220 from Mr Rennie would create minister-led reviews on a fixed cycle. I do welcome the recognition in both amendments that reviewing that should only be done after the commencement of the review section, to allow for commencement of other substantive provisions which we would want to be subject to review. But there are some issues with Amendment 220 because it prescribes detailed subject matter, for example, restraint, education exclusion, longitudinal and equalities data sets that either sit out with the bill or are already being progressed through separate work programmes and the refreshing of guidance. There's considerable work underway in partnership through the Story of Progress and the Data and Evidence Group led by Scotland's Chief Social Policy Advisor to enable us to show delivery on key aspects of the promise. This amendment also seeks to include reporting on actions taken in relation to matters beyond the scope of the bill, so including the exclusion of care-experienced young people from education. Amendment 218 from Mr Whitfield would place a duty on a parliamentary committee to report on the operation of the Act. Of course, parliamentary committees are already able to conduct such post-legislative scrutiny as they consider appropriate, and the Scottish Government, of course, always gives due consideration to any reports produced as a result of such post-legislative scrutiny. But it's nevertheless open to Parliament to place statutory duties on itself in this area. I would suggest to Mr Whitfield that it may be preferable to wait and see the review amendment that I hope to bring forward following discussions with members ahead of Stage 3 before asking the Parliament to decide whether it's a case that merits the taking of that step. I think there's 2 questions that we're all keen to answer. Is the legislation having the impact that we want it to have? And equally, have we successfully delivered what over 5,500 voices that informed the independent care review have told us must change?
Will the Minister give way?
Yes.
I just wonder, when the Minister speaks about looking at her amendment at stage 3, why she didn't consider bringing forward a review amendment at stage 2 so the committee could discuss that.
I brought forward the provisions that I aim to bring forward in the bill. As is the usual process for bills, a number of issues have came up in discussion with members and following reflection of the stage 1 debate that has made it clear to me that a review of this legislation would be appropriate. It wasn't brought in at stage 2, but I am making a commitment to bring that forward at stage 3 based on the opinions of other members. And as I say, I have a series of engagement already laid out in advance of stage 3 that I would be happy to discuss this with, to ensure that we get to a place that everyone is comfortable with. So, as I say, in recognising this and following consideration of the amendments presented, I would like to explore further an appropriate amendment at stage 3 that I hope we will all be able to agree on. So I would ask members not to press their amendments.
Thank you. I call on Martin Whitfield to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 218. Mr Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Convener. Again, we find ourselves in an interesting position where something which we recognise the importance of, we're unable to, or we are being invited not to place on the face of the bill. My amendment specifically requests the Scottish Parliament, and of course any committee of this Parliament has an innate right to investigate anything within its remit that it wants to do so. The purpose behind this amendment is to mark the importance of it and to lay something down, albeit I am always cautious, and I agree with Ross Greer on this, of the dangers of binding a future Parliament, but more than happy to bind a future government.
Minister.
I think there's two things that need to be considered here. As I said, the question, so we need to make sure that the Act is delivering on what the Act is supposed to deliver on. But there will also be a wider question for Parliament as the years move on in relation to, are we delivering on the promise? So I think the scope that Mr Whitfield's amendment takes us is in relation. I think these two things need to be considered together, but also separately, and perhaps we need to leave the route open to that, and that will form part of my discussions with members around the appropriate way forward for stage 3.
Martin Whitfield.
I thank the Minister for that intervention, and the Minister is right. There's two aspects of this. There's an overarching responsibility to how the bill is progressing, but there is also an obligation which is articulated through post-legislative scrutiny to absolutely drill down into what is happening with a piece of legislation. Is it as the Parliament envisaged when it passed, or are there unknown unknowns or known unknowns that have come into view? And I think, to be fair, all of the amendments that appear in this section are articulating a review of this specific bill and how far we are going forward to it. And as the Minister rightly said, she has concerns with regard to 219 and 220 because it overlaps reviews that are being considered or other elements that are going to be looked at. But I think there is an importance in doing that because, as we've heard in contributions this morning, there are areas that the bill hasn't yet envisaged reviews taking place that the Minister would like them to appear in. I think the advantage, albeit a burden on the Scottish Parliament, of the amendment that I propose is it places a duty on others to instigate that. The questions they ask themselves, although articulated at a very high level within the amendment, still allow the committee to scrutinise as they'd wish to do so. I'm happy to take an intervention.
Take another amendment. Take an intervention.
Happy to take another amendment.
I would definitely say that 219 and 220 would be government's preferred approach. I would be happy to support those amendments, but with the understanding that they will have to be revisited ahead of stage 3, given some of the concerns that I've laid out around looking at aspects that aren't actually contained in the bill and some of the other considerations. But to be very clear, I'm not trying to push this off to stage 3. I think we've been very clear that the committee members would like to see a review to ensure the Act is delivering on what it should be. As I say, I would just like to see further refinement of that ahead of discussions at stage 3.
Martin Whitfield.
Can I thank the Minister for that intervention, which I think is incredibly helpful, because I think if 219 and 220 appear on the bill at stage 2, it will allow progress towards what I hope would be a cross-parliament agreement on what the post-legislative scrutiny, and with that, I would seek to withdraw my amendment, Convener.
Thank you very much. Martin Whitfield seeks to withdraw Amendment 218. Does any member object? No member objects. Amendment 218 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 219 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 218. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 219 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. No. Sorry, we are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 219? And those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 219 is yes 9, no 1. Amendment 219 is therefore agreed to. I call Amendment 220 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 218. Willie Rennie, to move or not move?
For Paul O'Kane, move.
Let's see. The question is that Amendment 220 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. The question is that Section 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. I call Amendment 124 in the name of Sue Webber, already debated with Amendment 143. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 221 in the name of Paul O'Kane, already debated with Amendment 95. Paul O'Kane, to move or not move?
Yes. Move. Sorry.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 221 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 221? Thank you. And those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 221 is yes 3, no 7. Amendment 221 is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 222 in the name of Martin Whitfield, already debated with Amendment 167. Martin Whitfield, to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 224 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 95. Willie Rennie, to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 125 in the name of Ros McCall, already debated with Amendment 207. Ros McCall, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 223 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 207. Willie Rennie, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Just check, that's Amendment 223.
Yeah.
Yep, that's not moved. I call Amendment 123 in the name of Ros McCall, already debated with Amendment 81. Ros McCall, to move or not move?
Not moved.
The question is that Section 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 86 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 88. Minister, to move formally?
Not moved.
That is not. I'm just checking. Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. The question is that Section 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. I call Amendment 225 in the name of Paul O'Kane, already debated with Amendment 87. Paul O'Kane, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 225 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 225? Thank you. And those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 225 is yes 3, no 7. Amendment 225 is therefore not agreed to. The question is that Section 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. The question is that the long title of the bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that concludes Stage 2 consideration of the bill. Can I thank the Minister and her supporting officials for their time today and the last 2 days, and also members and other members who came forward with their amendments. I'm now going to suspend the meeting for 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much and welcome back. Our next item of business is an evidence session on VAT and independent schools. Can I welcome our witnesses from the Scottish Council of Independent Schools, Lorraine Davison, Chief Executive, Catherine Dyer, Chair, and John O'Neill, Chair of the Education and Partnership Committee. Thank you all for coming today, and I understand, Ms Davison, you've got an opening statement. So over to you.
Thank you, Convener, and members of the committee for your kind invitation to give evidence today. We appreciate this opportunity to assist the committee's consideration of VAT on independent school fees and to consider our members' potential in the coming years for future collaboration with the wider education sector and local communities in Scotland. The Scottish Council of Independent Schools represents 73 schools across Scotland, with just under a third designated as specialist. That's for those with significant educational needs, and the remainder are mainstream, many of which offer additional support provision for percentages of pupils similar to those identified in the state sector. We're concerned by the disproportionate impact that VAT on school fees is having on children, young people and the wider community in Scotland, as we predicted it would. The UK Government frequently referenced Eton, Harrow and Winchester ahead of the VAT on fees policy being introduced. However, Scottish independent schools are very different in culture and finances to these schools and do not fit the profile this policy was designed for. When Cedars in Greenock and Kilgraston in Perthshire closed, it was the pupils there who had their education disrupted. The teaching, support and administrative staff who lost their jobs, local suppliers who lost business, and state schools in Inverclyde and Perth and Kinross who had to accommodate additional pupil numbers at short notice. The Exchequer Secretary's letter to this committee contained no Scotland-specific analysis and relied instead on long-term estimates and funding decisions that apply only to England. The overall drop in our pupil numbers since VAT was imposed has been around 10%, with some schools seeing drops of more than 20%. If current trends continue, by next academic year, VAT on school fees is likely to cost Scotland more than it raises. For children forced out of the sector, this means disrupted education, loss of peer networks, perhaps being unable to access a place at their local state school or access a similar subject course programme if they're in S3 or above, as well as potential separation of siblings who'd previously been at the same school. For pupils with additional support needs, such disruptions are particularly damaging. At a time of increased teacher workload, high numbers of children with additional support needs across all schools and public funding constraints, as a largely not-for-profit charity sector, we're committed to building on our partnerships across state schools and communities. Catherine, John and I are very happy to take your questions and also hear your views on how we can build on our partnership work for all children in Scotland. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that opening statement. And there's a number of questions the committee will want to cover. But can I just start to how we got here? Because clearly this was a manifesto commitment by the Labour Party in opposition, and then they came into government. We have really struggled, I should say, to get anyone from the UK Labour government to attend. We invited the Education Secretary. She refused, suggesting it was a matter for the Treasury. We then invited the Scottish Secretary. He refused, suggesting it was a matter for another department. And we eventually, as you alluded to, got a letter from the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury. But we have found it very difficult and, quite frankly, frustrating that no UK Labour politician has been willing to come here to defend their policy. But I wonder, what discussions did you have with the Labour Party while they were coming up with this policy, while it was in the manifesto and post-election, to see if anything could be done to protect Scottish independent schools?
Thank you, Convener. So we did have discussions on behalf of our schools with Ian Murray when he was in opposition. He attended our annual conference, as did Pam Duncan-Glancy. And we have met Douglas Alexander on a visit to an independent school in his now constituency. We raised with the Cabinet Secretary at meetings we had with her, however, that we were really struggling to get meaningful engagement. So although we did have meetings, we were really struggling to get across that this policy was going to have a disproportionate impact on Scotland and to understand the consequences there were going to be on the devolved education system in Scotland. I also wrote to Bridget Phillipson. I did get a letter back from Bridget Phillipson, but I have to say it was similar to the kind of correspondence that this committee's had. The Cabinet Secretary did ask her officials to ask UK Government officials to make sure in the run-up to the implementation of the policy that they engaged with the Scottish Council of Independent Schools. We were invited to one meeting with Treasury officials, but again it was not a meeting where we felt that the really substantive points that we're making about Scottish education were particularly well understood.
And you referenced the letter we've had from the Exchequer Secretary. Do you think it's the UK Government refusing to accept the differences with Scottish education and the impact in Scotland, or misunderstanding the implications? It does seem to be quite a confused position they have in the correspondence with this committee and others about the impact in Scotland in particular. Are they just not getting it, or are they choosing to kind of assume that what they say from the UK Government will apply in Scotland when clearly it doesn't?
I think it's just a case of a policy that's been designed through the prism of Westminster and through the lens of English education. And English education is a very different beast to Scottish education. I think there have been a lot of assumptions made about the nature of independent schools and the nature of the sector. Labour politicians in the run-up to the implementation were frequently referencing, well, Eton, Harrow, Winchester, they can absorb this, they can protect their families from this. Those schools, type of schools, and the finances of those kind of schools just simply don't exist in Scotland. The sector is completely different, and it's not those schools that have paid the price for this policy. It's a school like Cedars outside Greenock that I suspect very few people on the committee have even heard of. But it's the pupils there, the parents there, the staff there that have paid the price.
And well, maybe before we go to my other point, just tell us what the price is. What is happening in terms of the number of schools that we understand, are in a very perilous state because of this, and others who have been unable to survive?
Our schools are mainly charities. They are viable charities, but sadly we have seen Kilgraston close, we have seen Cedars close, we've seen different arrangements in the sector so that they remain viable. They are doing everything they can to absorb costs and continue for independent education to be available to as many people as they can make it available to in Scotland. But they're having to right-size their schools. They're having to think, what size is this sector going to be in the future? So already 10% down as a sector in Scotland. We did warn the UK Government we would be harder hit because families in Scotland don't have the wealth levels of some parts of the southeast of England. So affordability was always going to be an issue here. So 10% down immediately. That is having an impact on not only those schools and families, it's having an impact on the economies of every community in Scotland. So you'll have seen the bigger report. We were a sector that contributed £500 million to the Scottish economy. Bigger Economics are in the final stages of doing an updated report, which we'll share with the committee. But this is no longer going to be a sector that's contributing those kind of sums into the Scottish economy. And this is a policy that is going to cost everybody in Scotland money.
And in terms of the schools that have sadly closed, could an argument be made they were in a difficult position and this tipped them over the edge, or is it your view and your members' views that this policy in particular is the one that led to those closures and could lead to further closures going forward?
We were really open in the run-up to the policy being designed, in that our schools in Scotland are charities. Any surplus they make is reinvested in education. They were already paying business rates in Scotland, so there weren't the finances there to absorb a sudden shock and a sudden increase of 20% in VAT coming in overnight. I mean, there were other ways of doing this policy. VAT didn't need to be set at 20%. It could have been introduced over a number of years. There were ways to minimise the impact on children who were already in the system and not have them forced out their schools, and particularly not have children with ASN being forced out their schools overnight. So there were lots of mitigations that could have been put in place, and I suppose it's our biggest regret that in those discussions that we didn't ever get into that space. It was, this policy is happening, there's a determination to make it happen, and it's going to happen as quickly as possible in the January of 2025. Even a delay to the implementation date would have been helpful.
I represent the Highlands and Islands, including the Murray constituency, which is home to Gordonston School. Gordonston is one of our biggest employers in Murray, so maybe a bit more detail about that, the family spend in terms of local economies. Can you give any information or update on that? And also, because I've met with the current and previous principals at Gordonston about the international reputation and attraction there is for international students to come to private schools such as Gordonston. Have we seen an impact from the international market because of this policy change?
We've seen other markets try to take advantage of this. So, for instance, Ireland don't have VAT on fees. So Ireland is making a big push to come to our boarding schools because they don't have VAT on school fees. So we're obviously now, as a nation, at a competitive disadvantage on the international stage. We did, before VAT, employ 12,000 people across Scotland. Convener, you're absolutely right about Gordonston. And I was up there myself recently and speaking to staff, and staff talking about how they were the third generation of that family to be working in the catering department at Gordonston, and simply didn't know what they would do, their family would do, and what lots of families in that area would do if that school were not to be there. Obviously, it's going to be there for some time to come, but we should be looking at this through the lens of, if we didn't have these independent schools, what would the situation be? And I think staff at these schools, and particularly operational staff, of which there are thousands, are acutely aware and really worried about the future of the schools. And also, it's I'm sure there'll be a butcher in Hopeman or a baker in Duffus or something. They're also going to be really impacted by this. So it's not just the people that are in the independent schools, it's the people that are benefiting from them in terms of the wider economy.
Sadly, we don't have a baker in Duffus, but a very good post office, and there is a very good butcher in Hopeman who my parents go to, so I won't go too much into that for fear of having to declare an interest. Ms Dyer, I wondered if there's anything as chair you wish to add at the moment.
Obviously a recent chair, but coming into the sector and sort of learning about it, actually what I've discovered is it's a very different sector to what I anticipated, and especially in terms of the schools that do the special educational needs part of it. I really wasn't aware of that as a member of the public looking at it, and the assistance to people who require it for things that are in the same proportion as some of the state schools. So it's a very different sector. I think we've got the idea that it is like having the schools of Eton, etc. And Scotland is not like that. And I think looking at what came from the Treasury, what was interesting to me was that the figure of 3,000 was for the first year across the United Kingdom, as they thought. And actually what we've seen in Scotland, that we've almost reached that already. And that's the impact in Scotland. And clearly, I don't know what the impact is in England and Wales because we don't even have that in that letter. But it was not, a 3,000 in one big lump that was expected. And here we are, we're in that position. And I think, when you look at this, where the schools are placed, again, very different. Lots of schools that are really vital to the economy, as you say. And they're viable charities, but it's like, how far can you go with this? And there is, I think, a dismay that plans for what would be engagement with the wider community, very good work that is done that's jointly with schools in the neighbourhoods, etc. It's pushing that amount of investment, etc., that the schools can put in, because it's, as Lorraine said, the vast majority are charities that are not for profit, and it's all going back in to sort of education in Scotland.
And before I go to other members, Mr O'Neill, can you tell us about the Education Partnership Committee and the work you have done and are perhaps planning to do going forward on this issue?
Yeah, thank you, Convener, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Partnerships is a critical feature of life for independent schools. Like all schools in Scotland, all schools, there is significant areas of community activity and community service and charitable activity that's curricular-based in developing aspects of citizenship, skills and an understanding of the wider world. But critically, areas of educational innovation and development is the main focus of the Partnerships Committee. And for example, if I can mention such things as that partnership impacts over 100,000 children in Scotland who don't go to independent schools. So they don't attend independent schools, but they benefit from the work of independent schools. I think that's important to recognise. For example, there's the Futures Institute at Dollar Academy that 72,000 children have accessed and worked on. Teachers from 8 local authorities are involved in FIDA, as it's referred to. At the High School of Glasgow, where there is the START Entrepreneurship and Design Thinking Initiative for S6, there are currently 20 schools in Scotland participating in the START programme. The school was delighted to receive support from the Scottish Government via the Education Entrepreneurship Pathways support. And therefore, our focus in the Partnership Committee is, in fact, contributing to the wider ecosystem of Scottish education. I would point to things like the Hayward Report, the Logan Review, and the fact that we're looking in Scotland, critically looking at the need to develop skills and awarenesses in the real world, tech understanding, collaborational skills, communication, resilience, the ability to deal with failure and the ability to learn from failure. All of these practical factors that we wish to try and capture to produce a workforce and a citizenship that's fit for the future, a very unknown future. And there are great innovative actions going on that are in line with the general trend of a movement around the reform programme in Scottish education. And independent schools are actively, not simply participating in that, but are working with fellow state schools. And I was delighted initially, as a former head myself, to have held the very first conference, short conference between SLS, School Leaders Scotland, and the independent sector 2 years ago. So there is also good conversation and an appetite within state schools amongst the specialists and practitioners to engage in these particular aspects, and we wish to grow that. My only comment to the committee, understandably, is the more cuts that we make, the more staffing cuts that we make, the pressures are there. I was a head up until recently, and I had to say farewell to 20 teachers last year as a consequence, 20 teachers as a consequence of this policy, directly this policy.
Thank you.
So that's the kind of context.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's all very helpful. We'll go to John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. And maybe I should start by saying that I was at Hutchinson's. I did not enjoy my school experience. I don't know if I'd have enjoyed any other school, but the best days of my life have certainly been since I left school. However, the economy, you were saying that you think maybe 500 million is the amount of money that goes into the economy. I take it that's the total of the fees and so on. But I mean, if the independent schools were not there, that money would still be there, and people might be spending more in Scottish restaurants, eating more Scottish food, having holidays in Scotland. So it wouldn't be a loss to the economy, it would just be spent in different ways. Is that correct?
So IFS tried to do some work around that area and said some of those things. I've spoken to economists and tried to interrogate that further, and they've said that there isn't really any credible methodology that they could use to ascertain if our schools weren't there, what would happen to that money in terms of the economy. Some of the things they've pointed to, though, is if our schools weren't there and parents weren't paying fees, they might decide to make changes to their working hours. They might not work such long hours. That there would be job losses, certainly if our sector wasn't there, into areas of the economy where there are no other jobs. So that would be a pressure on the state even further if they're not able to get those jobs. And the behaviour change stuff around like holidays and restaurants, the people that are forced out of the independent sector at the moment are those who are financially not able to continue with the fees. So those people are those on a certain level of means that are not about to be going around and making great big investments, so they might be cutting their working hours, and that's a reducing the tax take. I don't think there's any credible evidence around that suddenly there's going to be a big boost into the economy because of that spending power. They might put it into their pension and so on, but I don't think it would be a real blow to the Scottish economy if you were to lose a sector of that size. It would be massive.
Except if they all go on foreign holidays, then it won't boost our economy very much at all. On the point of teachers losing their jobs, now we're short of secondary teachers in a number of subjects, and presumably if there's more kids leaving the private sector going into the state sector, there's a need for more teachers in the state sector. So is it the case that teachers leaving your sector can't find jobs? Or
Correct. I think you'll find that there's a significant number of temporary contracts within the state sector, not permanent, full-time, guaranteed jobs. And I think that is the critical aspect, and that's something that played on my conscience significantly when I was having to oversee such a change in size of school as a consequence. So some areas, computing, for example, will benefit. Other areas, it is more difficult to move in to. And it's not a case of replenishing the state system through those who lose jobs, unfortunately, in the independent sector. And some will look elsewhere, including individuals looking at international schools and so forth as well.
Okay. Now, as the convener said, the Treasury and the UK government have not been particularly helpful in engaging with us. But in their letter, they talk about gaining 1.8 billion, I think it is, and the cost to the state sector would only be 300 billion. So they obviously see they're making a big profit in this. Do you recognise these figures?
The 1.8 is in the very, very long term, and what we've seen is recalculations of figures, and I think the policy is certainly in Scotland not going to raise as much as they would have anticipated, because they certainly didn't see coming the fact that we were going to shrink as a sector literally overnight by 10%, and there will be further shrinkage to come. So certainly in Scotland, there's not going to be anything like the amount of money that they thought raised. Like the committee, we've struggled to see where the benefits are for any child in Scotland as a result of this policy.
I mean, one of the points you make is that children might be doing GCSEs and then they move into a state sector. I mean, that raises the question with me, why are they doing GCSEs? Is that not a bit unwise to be using another country's exam system in Scotland?
So we have got a significant number of international families in Scotland, and if you're an international family and your child's going to be in Scotland, you as a family are going to be in Scotland for 3 or 4 years, and you don't anticipate perhaps staying in Scotland, you might want to go to England, you might be going back to a native France or Germany, then there are families who want to be educated in Scotland but are seeking the education qualifications that are going to suit their child and their family experience in years to come. So we've got the IB in some of our schools, we've got GCSEs, we've got A-levels, we've got BTECs, and that's all about a really strong provision that exists in Scotland, and for us to attract families from the rest of the world to come here and study and to be able to access the curriculum and the qualifications that's going to suit their child.
So can you give us an idea of proportions? I mean, how many children from independent schools go to Scottish universities and how many go elsewhere?
I don't have that exact stat at the moment, but I am in the process of pulling together stats on the number of children that we attract internationally who are staying at Scottish universities and obviously paying the international university fees. So I will have a figure of that for you, John, in the next month or two, because I think that is a significant figure, and it's a significant boost not just to the Scottish economy but also to our universities.
Okay, and maybe just finally, I take it there's kind of two categories. There's the parents who have got so much money that it doesn't matter what happens to the fees, they still go to either Scottish or Harrow or whatever independent schools. But there's others, just the kind of ordinary families who are just making, maybe, as you've suggested, working extra hours I mean, is that a fair assumption? So one lot will not be affected by this, but one lot will be.
Yeah, and in Scotland, we have more of those families in that category of who were just making it to pay the fees at Cedars, and Cedars had a meeting with their parent body and said, VAT is coming in, you are not a wealthy cohort of people, you are just people whose children needed a little bit of extra support. And we have quite a lot of people who never intended to send their children into the independent sector, but maybe they have gone to the state sector. They have struggled with ASN and they've come into the independent sector. I was at one of our schools in East Lothian actually, and was quite touched by the fact they had a really strong ASN department, and you had children who'd come in there because they were struggling in the state sector, came in to that school in Haddington for a few years and really began to thrive. And the success story the head teacher was talking about was, and that some of those pupils are now thriving and have been able to go off really successfully into the state sector again, into secondary. And that's now a pressure that the local state secondary isn't going to have to pick up. It's a child that has been able to access some support somewhere else in another part of the Scottish education system. It's not a them and us. It's, I'm going to do something different for a few years. It worked. And now I can go back and access my great Scottish state school education. So if we just get over some of the ideology and work together and just respect that some families didn't intend to go to independent schools, want to make a different choice, and we're working as a sector to make sure that choice is as available to as many people as possible to come into our schools. And if it's not available to people to come into our actual schools with their children, that we do all the great work that John's doing through the Partnership Committee to benefit those 100,000 kids in Scotland who are not in our schools but who can benefit from them. And we'd really like to work with the committee on how we can, because we accept that work is not strategic at the moment because it's school by school. But I think there is scope in Scotland to make that work more strategic, more meaningful, and for us to be a bigger part of the solution in Scotland.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Convener.
Miles Briggs.
Convener, good morning. Thank you for joining us today. As an Edinburgh and Lothian MSP, I wanted to specifically look at Edinburgh. 15% of families send their children to the independent sector, and independent schools here in the capital. And I've spoken to a number of schools, so no behaviour change is already happening. But I wanted to see if you have any up-to-date data. I think the latest census, which SCIS provided, 9,310 pupils were in Edinburgh schools. Edinburgh City Council have told me that 23,150 secondary pupils are here in the capital, the highest level since the 1980s, with rolls up 3 to 4% this year. 16 schools are going to be over capacity by 2030. So given that situation in the state sector, where do you see this capacity if more pupils are coming, and what joined up thinking is taking place if we do see more and more families having to look towards not being able to cover the additional costs and therefore local authorities needing to find more places?
Well, that was, SCIS is a charity, and we take our charity obligations really seriously. So the bigger economic report that we did 2 years ago was the first time that we had ever looked at where are the children in the independent sector, where do they live, and match and to fund that work, so that for the first time the system and local authorities who we made it available to had real data on the number of children that they were responsible for in their local authority who were currently in the independent school system. So we are really keen to keep going with that data, because what we want to do is support all children in Scotland. And if children do need to leave our sector, we want to do that planning with others and help others as much as we can to make sure that there are smooth transitions. And I know any local authority will have plans in place to have smooth transitions. But it's a policy that has resulted in children having to leave school mid-academic year, to have to do different subject choices. It's been really, really damaging to those children who've been involved. And we will definitely keep going with gathering the data. And I think you touch on some really, really important points, Miles. I mean, another unintended consequence of these capacity issues in schools in Edinburgh over capacity is for the families that had always intended the state sector. There's also going to be things like real pressure on housing costs. So if you're in a catchment area for a good state school, you can expect to see the housing costs there increase significantly as a result of this policy. And yet again, that's another area that's just going to force more people from having the choice of school that they would otherwise have had.
And in terms of feedback from schools, I know it's obviously first year of the policy being in place, but understanding behavioural change parents are maybe then looking at in terms of a choice over years that children will be at an independent school, and almost looking towards if they can get the exam results they need, taking them out earlier than they would have for gap years, etc., and whether or not that is starting to also be considered, because I think the financial model for the independent sector to be sustainable could also then be jeopardised by additional behavioural change going forward as well.
As you say, Miles, it's in really infancy of the policy, and we don't know the full harm it's going to have. We think it will take probably about 5 years because, as you say, it will be the next key stage. Do parents not enter at junior one, or do they come out and not stick with it for secondary? So we are going to see behaviour change. I don't know, John, if you've got anything you want to add on that.
You're certainly seeing there's been a long-term behavioural change as inflationary pressures on fees pre-VAT played a role, because I think it's important to remember that independent schools in Scotland were largely all in the SSPA pension scheme, and for that matter shadow the SNCT pay rates, and therefore if you were to take SNCT and pension and changes in those areas in recent years, coupled with, of course, the introduction of business rates, then there were already inflationary pressures pushing on. And that already saw some early indications of behavioural changes with, for example, increased applications at the latter periods of primary, so kind of primary 4 upwards, fewer earlier, and for that matter, an increase also in individuals applying around the S3 and S4 year groups, particularly S3, and you saw behaviour change there. With VAT, that's only an increased catalyst in terms of those behavioural aspects. What is interesting, of course, from our most recent data from the SCIS from August and September of 25, there's been a 14% decline in S1 applications across our sector this year, for example. There's been a 13.6 decline in primary 1 applications in comparison to other year groups where we would take. So as Lorraine has outlined, we anticipate that over the different admission cycles over the next 2 to 3 years, the real impact will be much more evident. But certainly there is behavioural change from that point of view, no question about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I was looking at the Adam Smith Institute report into some of the projected data, which they've, I think, kind of undermined, and especially if we look towards if parents are going to have this behavioural change, the Treasury won't be receiving any money from that, and that's not been projected or taken into account. I wanted to return to ASN, because currently Scottish Government's undertaking a welcome review into ASN, which is a cross-party review. I know a lot of parents here in Edinburgh who specifically make sacrifices to use independent schools to make sure that their children get the support that they want. And as we've already outlined, Lorraine, can really make sure that then they're on a good pathway to succeed in secondary school and in life. I wondered what data you had, and again, maybe through the context of Edinburgh as well, how many young people are at the independent schools across Scotland who have an additional support need, and what that would then look like, and what percentage of families are deciding to be unable to continue with their children's education in the independent sector, because I think that's not really been taken into account, and something we should really consider as part of the government's review as well, to make sure that these young people are going to be given the best opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, certainly our schools are seeing an increased demand and have been for quite a number of years from families of children who have additional support needs. So I think it's fair to say that the numbers in the independent sector, the percentages that of children with ASN are very, very similar to the percentages that we see in the state sector, so around 40%. There will be the families who traditionally, through generations, have sent their children into independent schools and had to always made provision and plans for that. If you have a child with additional support needs, that's not always been your plan. And those are the people that I feel are being disproportionately impacted by this policy, because those are not the people that had savings or had wealth. These are the people that are just trying to make something better for their child for as big a number of years as they possibly can. So in terms of the data on that, the SCIS census has been the main mechanism for measuring pupil numbers. But I would be very happy, Miles, certainly to look at Edinburgh specifically, because it's the biggest part of Scotland in terms of the independent sector, and it's going to be the biggest pressure because of the capacity issues in the state sector. So I would be happy to ask our Edinburgh schools if they could collect more specific data around ASN and what that pressure might look like on the local authority, and I'd be very happy, obviously, to share that with the local authority. We try to work as meaningfully as we can with local authorities, and we keep in very regular touch with officials at Scottish Government as well, so that if we're missing anything in terms of our data or a part of the system that it would be helpful to get that data to them, we work with Scottish Government officials to do that as well.
Thank you for that. And can I ask, do you know of any discussions which are taking place within Scottish Government and COSLA in relation to funding formulas to react to a potential increase? Edinburgh City Council receives the lowest per head of population from the Scottish Government, partly in terms of the education budget that is aligned with the numbers of pupils obviously who are in the independent sector. So just wondered is that being taken into account in terms of the projected additional needs and costs, or is that conversation just to come when the schools are at a point where they're over capacity?
Not sure what the current state of play is in terms of government and local authority discussions around this, but we are really happy to help to inform any of those discussions, attend those discussions and share the information we're seeing, both in terms of data and in behaviour change, if that would be helpful to them.
Right. Thanks, Convener.
I'll come to Paul McLennan, but just on that point, we invited COSLA to come to give evidence. They felt they had nothing to add. What have your discussions with COSLA been, or has it been more at individual council level? Do you have a relationship with COSLA on this?
In terms of COSLA, so when SCIS was pulling together what we thought the impact of this policy was going to be, we did a draft response to the UK Treasury. We shared that draft response with Scottish Government, we shared it with the trade unions, and we shared it with COSLA. And we said we're really happy, we want you to know this is what we think the impact is going to be, and really happy to take on board any of your suggestions. It was good that two trade unions, School Leaders Scotland and NASUWT, actually picked up and echoed the points we made about job losses and the January implementation date being too fast, and urged a delay on that. So that was really helpful. COSLA didn't respond, as I recall, in terms of that offer, and I'm very happy to meet with COSLA at any time to update them on our latest information.
And what about individual councils like Murray Council with Gordonston, Edinburgh Council, etc.? Is there discussions at a local level? Maybe Mr O'Neill?
Yeah.
It's patchy.
Okay.
And certain local authorities engage well with their independent schools, other local authorities not so well. Okay. So it is patchy. I suppose as one Director of Education put it to me in one conversation, John, you're not a threat to our schools, so I don't give much thought to them, okay. Which was one way of looking at it.
Okay. Slightly disappointing way, but one way nonetheless. Paul McLennan.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I'm the MSP for East Lothian, and Lorraine, you mentioned Compass, and I've visited there a few times, and I'll come on to them in a wee second. I've also got Belhaven Hill in my own hometown in Dunbar, and I think you mentioned about 5% of children travel into Edinburgh every day in terms of that. A couple of things I think for me. One, you mentioned about the short implementation date, and when obviously speaking to Compass, that was their biggest concern that they had was future planning. Like any business, they need to plan in terms of what their cash flow is in terms of that. This was on top of the employees' national insurance contributions as well, so it put real pressure in terms of that. So I don't know if you can say a wee bit more around about the impact, I suppose, the cumulative impact with employers' national insurance contributions on the sector as a whole as well. And I've got a few other questions, but maybe just on that particular point, because I know that's putting real focus and real concern on Compass on their long-term sustainability.
Yeah, obviously schools were aware that if Labour won the election, VAT and fees was a possibility. They were hoping they would have got longer, and it was the worst possible scenario in terms of the implementation date. So that was really, really difficult. And then, of course, we had the budget with the employers' national insurance. I don't have an exact figure, but it's roughly the employers' national insurance on the independent school sector is about equivalent to what our schools are paying in business rates. So if you recall, the Parliament had a lot of engagement with my predecessor, John Edward, and SCIS around how difficult business rates, removal of business rates relief was going to be for the sector. So that happened. They dealt with that. They've absorbed that. They've also had the increases in teacher pay and pensions, which has been really difficult for them to absorb. Then there was a VAT and fees, and then, as you say, the employer national insurance. So I think it's around £8–9 million across the sector of what that was going to cost them to cope with. So a huge amount of financial pressures, and that's not a special pleading case. Lots of parts of the education system facing budget constraints, so we're no different to that in that. But I think there were assumptions made around the policy that somehow independent schools were a dripping roast and would be able to keep absorbing without that level of engagement and understanding about what the reality of the finances are for viable charities that don't exist to make profits.
Yeah. I mean, can I just make one additional point to your own point with regard to planning? The one benefit of the business rates coming in, was we had time. So, I know when I was in action as a head with my board, we knew we had a few years to change our budgets, our business planning, etc., to absorb and facilitate that, and to make cuts where necessary and so forth. Quite clearly, that wasn't the case come January 2025, of course.
A few other questions, I think, for me, because one, in terms of Compass, obviously that's impacted on the pupil role. I think people who attend Compass come from all over East Lothian and with East Lothian as well. I know from different sectors of the community as well, so I know it's a very well-respected school within that. Just coming back to the point, Lorraine, you mentioned about children with additional support needs. I know very much how Compass focus on that as well. We had a couple of meetings and talked around about that, in particular with the increase in neurodiversity as well. I think that's an issue that's impacting schools right across Scotland and in the rest of the UK. In terms of that, I don't know if you can say a little bit more around about the ESN and the neurodiversity kind of issue, because again, the Equality Committee's looked at that, the Health Committee's looked at neurodiversity in terms of what the sector's doing, in terms of looking at how they impact on education with those with neurodiversity, because that has, I know, in parents attending Compass, have seen that as a real benefit to their children.
Without question, I mean, it's as you say, the whole area of ASN and particularly growth in terms of neurodiversity and children presenting has witnessed significant investment from schools into their ASN provision. So the mainstream selective, even those that still have some level of selection, have certainly increased their budgets, or not increased their budgets, but shifted their budget towards ASN and the employment of staff and expertise in that area. It's certainly an area where a number of parents, as Lorraine has already outlined, have made those decisions, not expecting to make those decisions because of the pressures, and there are significant pressures, unfortunately, on the state sector within this area. And those parents who have decided that they want to try and either afford this, or particularly when you see bursary applications coming in, and a number of bursary applications are tied. You know, if I look at the number of individuals coming to the school that I was once ahead of, there were more and more ASN individuals applying for bursary and receiving bursary, fortunately. That tells you that there's, you know, an issue there that we recognise and have to be explored, but particularly in terms of the schools themselves, the investment and change to budget and how we allocate and use budget towards ASN has significantly increased, and in fact has become an area that also has more parents asking more questions. And one thing I would like to say in this area is that when VAT came in, the group of parents within the school who were most anxious about the changes it would cause, i.e. cuts, and knowing that staffing and things would be changed, were our ASN families in particular, because they obviously thought, well, we could be the first to go type of thing in their mind. Obviously that wasn't the case, but they were the most anxious group, understandably.
And just on that point, I think, because that's a really, having discussions with Compass, they actually specifically mentioned that, and I think that was a real point of concern there. I suppose the other key thing, I think, for Mel, and when I visited Compass the last time, they just won a national award for intergenerational education. I think the Minister for Equalities had gone out and spoke to them as well, and it was fantastic to see, was the link to the local community. And again, this was particularly in Haddington, in terms of what they've done in terms of working with people from different parts of the community. I don't know if you can say any more around about the sector and its influence on that. I can see it and the importance it had in Haddington and in Compass specifically, but I don't know if you can say a little bit more around about how the sector kind of looks at that.
Certainly the sector has you know, both historically and currently engaged in supporting local schools. Everything from readers going out to schools and working with children in those contexts. There's been a lot of success with the volunteer tutor organisation and that charity, and significant support for after-school homework clubs and so forth in areas of deprivation, in particular in Glasgow. And I know Glasgow better than say what's happening in Edinburgh. Schools have made significant contributions in those fronts, and all voluntary, all valued, and then being able to obviously use our premises and so forth to give opportunities, for example, for study camps before exams, etc., for these organisations as well. So our facilities, coupled to actually our pupils and some of our staff directly involved, is something that goes on in the schools, and it enriches the education of everyone involved, but is a real direct contribution to the community.
Thanks. And I suppose one final question. I know you mentioned about the interaction, I suppose, with local authorities. I know Compass works very well with the local authority in terms of that. I suppose the key thing, I think, for me is we're still probably in the very early stages in terms of the impact it's going to have on the schools. And you talked about some of the figures already dropping. Where do you see this in the next 2 or 3 years in terms of, and again, it's almost a piece of string, but we're already seeing an impact, but where do you see this in the next 2 or 3 years? If you were coming back here in 3 years' time saying, what impact has this had on you? Where do you kind of see this?
Well, in our submission to the UK government, we said that if this did come in, we anticipated the sector in Scotland would shrink by 20%. Bigger Economics have worked out at the point we shrink by 13% or more. That's the point where we cost the state money in Scotland. We've already shrunk by 10%. So I think our 20% estimate was correct at the time we said it. We never put a timescale on how long it would take for our sector to be 20% smaller, but nothing has happened since to make me think that there would be any change from that. And our schools are working so hard to make sure that they continue to provide excellent education and partnership work for as many people as they possibly can. But you just have to look at the finances and the realities of how many people are there in Scotland that can afford the kind of fees that we now have with a 20% increase, and the maths just don't add up to there not being a substantial impact. And we'll continue to do everything we can to mitigate that and to keep doing all the really good work that we're doing with communities. I mean, another good thing, apart from what our schools do in terms of communities, is SCIS gathers together what's happening in our schools and some of the innovative best practices, which John alluded to at FIDA or the Glasgow Academy rolling out resources, learning resources, which are available to every member of the public in Scotland. And we sit on the Curriculum and Assessment Board in Scotland, we sit in the General Teaching Council Board, and pretty much every important forum in Scottish education, and we do that not to make a special case, but we do that because we're charities representing other charities, and we see our work in Scotland as about contributing in. And this has been such a valuable session, I think, today in helping us to explain some of those things.
Thanks, Convener.
Rennie.
Thank you very much for giving evidence this morning. I mean, I care about all pupils at state schools and in independent schools, but I particularly am concerned about those from modest backgrounds. Because if I was a parent and I had sent my child to one of those schools, I would want to make sure that they had continuity of education. So once they started, that they would finish. I wouldn't want to change midstream because that would interrupt their quality of education. And I know that many parents are exactly in that position, and they are now, because they're on modest incomes, having to sacrifice significantly in other areas. Do you have experiences, reports about what the sacrifices are that those families are making in order to make sure their children's education is continued?
I think that's a really good point, Willie. There are parents making sacrifices, and you know, I don't think it's ever helpful, some of the sort of reporting you get in certain sections of the media, particularly down south, about some of the examples of sacrifices that wealthier people are making. But back in Scotland, reality, the people that were at Cedars or Kilgraston who needed that continuity of education, and the state, local authorities have got really good systems in place for welcoming children in, so I'm not taking away from that at all. But as you say, and families move home and children move school, of course they do, and of course they survive. But what is really harmful to a child is what you've alluded to, is moving for negative circumstances. So not moving because, oh look, we're moving to a nice area of the country, or the family have chosen to move to a different area, but you are being forced out your school due to financial reasons. I think there are difficult situations, and John will know more about some of the examples, but maybe a family having to choose, well, we can afford to keep one in, so we'll keep one in to do the exam years, but little brother or sister can't, and those situations are really, really difficult. There's also a father I spoke to who was desperately upset because their family circumstances where they had a young child who was terminally ill, and the wraparound and the care they could get for their other child to continue having a what they called a more normal life, and freeing them up to care for their terminally ill child. And they were having to pay significant amounts. They said, we can't afford to pay the VAT and fees because the cost of keeping our other terminally ill child going with oxygen all night is really expensive. And these families have never been taken into account in terms of this policy.
No. I mean, it's the classic example of, policy doesn't affect institutions, it affects people. And I certainly know from my other colleagues and my own experiences that November 24 through to February 25 in particular witnessed a good number of individuals having to leave the school for financial reasons. Some of them unable to get, particularly if there was two children, unable, and in secondary, particularly the secondary context, not the primary context, where of course birth rates is a factor currently just now in terms of a allocation of spaces. So you were certainly seeing in the secondary context families having to then send their children to two different schools because there was no space in S2 in that school, but there was in the other one, and there was a space in S3 that came up and such like. So there's those aspects in terms of what was happening at that time. And to be fair to local authorities, they aren't in a position to immediately, despite their good work, to respond to a change in allocations at that stage. At the same time, the anxiety for children having to move when it was an unplanned move, completely unplanned move, is something we should always be aware of. There's plenty of research in terms of the impact that that has on future engagement, at least for the first year of that change. And then coupled to all of that is the anxiety that it caused for children thinking that there was something wrong in the family's finances, and that, you know, so they've got worries about their family, etc. And there's nothing wrong with their finances. They just can't afford that particular thing any longer. And the anxiety that was also created for children. You're coming into school on a Monday, and let's get really practical here, if you don't mind. You know, you're coming into school on a Monday. So I had pupils who came in on Monday. They didn't know if they were leaving to get that place on Thursday or 2 weeks after that. And some of them found out on the Wednesday that you're not coming back tomorrow morning. That was happening. That was happening. There's the real cliff edge for children. And if I'm clearly passionate about one thing, about this whole policy, and it's certainly nothing to do with Scotland in that regard, or the Scottish Parliament, or this committee, or the Scottish Government, far from it, at no point did anybody think about the consequences to the children. You can question the sins of the parents in making this choice about where they send their children, but you don't visit that on the children, and you don't visit on their education. And that, unfortunately, was happening in real time, in real circumstances. And I had one case where I took a boy back simply because he couldn't get the 5 hires that he was started with us. He couldn't get coursed for it, and he was applying for medicine, and he doesn't get the chance to sit 5 hires because he couldn't get into a particular school. So, fine, we took him back, obviously for absolutely nothing. But I worked out he'd spent three weeks looking, and this was back in January, February of that year, and I thought, that's 3 weeks too long. Get yourself back in here, and let's get through this year, and then we can make some decisions. And that's obviously reflected in other aspects. Unfortunately, that's history now, but that was the impact.
I mean, just to declare an interest, I suppose, I've got St Leonard's School in St Andrews, and I'm a fan, unashamed fan of it, because they've got walls around the school, but actually they are very open. They work in partnership. They do Saturday schools in various subjects. They've got joint sports activities. They share their grounds. They're fully integrated into the community. I'm quite a pragmatic politician. If it works, I don't want to break it. I don't want to change it. I just want to keep on doing the things that work, and they work. They also attract people from across the globe, ties up with the university in terms of staff that are there for short periods, want to put their children into good quality education, and they take that opportunity. So it works. So therefore, my belief is we shouldn't change it. But my question really is have you ever secured an answer from the UK government as to why they adopt a singular targeted approach on VAT on education for your sector compared with nurseries or universities or colleges where my understanding is there is no VAT on education in those sectors? Have you ever had an explanation from it as to why you've been targeted?
No, we haven't. And I think some of this must go back to we were just a sector that it was popular to target, and if politicians had taken the time that you've taken, or Paul's taken, and the convener's taken, and Miles has taken, and everybody around this table has taken, to go out into your communities to see these schools and to see the kind of work that you've seen, I don't think that approach would have been taken. But I think Catherine's got ideas about
I think
how we can do more.
It's very sort of disappointing that in terms of all of the policy documentation that came along with it, there wasn't really a question apart from that it would make sufficient money to be put back into state education. And I think the sad thing about it is that in the Scottish context, as we said before about reaching the milestone of what they thought was going to happen in the first year across the United Kingdom, being the position in Scotland with the number of pupils that are either left or not entered. The take on VAT in comparison to that, our understanding is, that within the next academic year, it'll end up in some, if it was able to be hypothecated, which it isn't, but if it was, then there would be less money for Scotland out of that. So, you know, in that short space of time, it hasn't achieved for Scotland and for children in Scotland, regardless of whether they're the independent sector or the state sector. And I think it's really regrettable because there has been no acceptance or understanding that it is a different situation. And it's fine to say about Eton or whatever, but you see the reality in Scotland is different, and going out in communities, and no thought also about the wider economic position, because it is sustainable. There's going to have to be change, obviously. I mean, that's inevitable. There's already been some change, so it's not all about closures, but it is about perhaps movement or whatever. It is about less staff, as John was saying, in a school. I mean, that's quite a significant number of teachers not to have in another year. So that was what SCIS, before I became part of it, was really warning about, and unfortunately that has come to pass.
Thank you. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Just still morning. Lorraine, if I picked you up right at the start, I think you said that your expectation is that this policy is going to cost more than it will save/generate in the next financial year, or next school year, I presume. Could you just talk us through what's the working behind that a bit? Because I take on board the point you made to John Mason a moment ago about the UK government's £1.7, £1.8 billion figure, that being at the end of their projection 29-30. But next year, though, they're for 26-7, so the imminent financial year, their expectation is that this would raise £1.5 billion. That's UK-wide. How in Scotland have you worked out that there would actually be a net loss?
So it was Bigger Economics that worked out there would be a net loss at the point we shrink by 13%. I have a hard copy of their report with me today, which I can give to you, because they set out the workings in that. So it's basically based on once we shrink by that point, we're employing fewer staff, they're contributing less into the tax system, and there's those additional pressures that are then being picked up by the state system. But Bigger clear on how they've arrived at that and how they've worked that out. So I think it would be helpful if I share their methodology with you.
Be useful, because I've not looked at the Bigger report this morning, but having looked at it previously, my recollection was they hadn't laid out all of their methodology. So I could be wrong on this specific point. One of the questions that occurred to me was the point John made a moment ago about the falling primary role in the state sector anyway because of demographic change, lower birth rate. I'm not sure whether points like that are being taken into consideration. Yes, your role has fallen disproportionately more than would be the case purely on the basis of the falling birth rate, but that is part of it, and I would want to make sure that figures like that had been extracted before coming up with that conclusion.
That new report, I think, around the end of March, that I'm going to share with the committee, and yeah, if you look at our Junior 1 intake down 13%, but the falling birth rate part across Scotland, I think, is 2.8%. So there is a big gulf there. So you are correct that some of this, some of the pressure and some of the pupil numbers we're seeing will be impacted by demographics, but that's really at the margins compared to what we're seeing, and we'll have the updated data on the economics around this from Bigger Economics, and I'm really happy to share their methodology as well.
That would be great, thanks. Do you accept the point that the IFS have made that the marginal cost of a fee paying, so if we filter out the parts of the independent sector that are special schools and the pupils who attend are largely state funded but through a separate method, for your fee paying pupils, the IFS have made the point that the marginal cost of them moving into the state sector is actually lower because they're far less likely to have the kind of complex additional needs that result in significant additional costs.
Again, I mean, I just think that completely misunderstands the nature of the sector in the UK, and particularly the nature of the sector in Scotland. I mean, I just think that is completely unfounded and unrealistic to think that's the case. We've got children that are specifically in our sector because of the level of need, and if we can keep those families in our sector, then that's a pressure that's not going into the state sector. Obviously, there's going to be falling pupil roles in the state sector, and that might have helped with some of the pressures that the trade unions tell us about exist in the state sector around teacher workload, very high levels of ASN and increasing support needs and behaviour needs that need to be supported and met. So if you had those falling roles, but if our families are moving from our sector into that sector, they're not going to get the full benefit of a little bit of breathing space that they might otherwise have had.
This is definitely where I do begin to struggle, though, because the IFS have laid out their methodology for that. Have you challenged them on that, questioned them on that? Because, I mean, to me, it looks like their maths works. They've demonstrated why the marginal cost is lower based on the demographics of the independent sector versus the state sector.
Anything in the IFS didn't approach us. They didn't speak to any of the schools in Scotland in the run-up to doing their report. So I don't know what work they've done and how they think that what they've done in the UK applies in Scotland.
So on that point, because you've made a very clear case this morning that there's a distinct difference between Scotland and primarily England, rest of the UK, but primarily talking about the difference between Scotland and England here. And you've repeatedly made this point that, you know, a lot of the political rhetoric around this has been Eton, Harrow, etc. Scotland doesn't have Eton and Harrow, but we do have some very elite schools. Right? Glenalmon's now owned by the former Qatari foreign minister, I believe. I was just looking this morning, so the fees, so this is 23/4 fees, so it'll be a bit higher now, but Gordonston's boarding fees were about 50 grand a year, Merchiston 40, Strathallan 41. These are elite schools, aren't they? These are overwhelmingly elite schools for the children of by far the most privileged people in society.
These are internationally highly respected schools. I think, convener might correct me, but I think at Gordonston, something like a third of their pupils were in receipt of some kind of bursary support. So there will be wealthy international pupils who are attracted to Scotland and attracted to that school in Murray. And as a result of those fees that they are paying, a large proportion of those fees will go towards supporting. I think Gordonston's always had an ethos around, you know, it needs to be a school that the local fishing family can go to. And, you know, the fees of some of those people that we're attracting into this country that will then stay in, hopefully go on to Scottish universities and contribute there, is supporting local families to be able to access that education. And they also do outreach work around voluntary things that really contribute to the economy and communities in Murray as well. So they are a big contributor. Yes, there are high fees, but it shouldn't be seen through the lens of it's only for the wealthy and it's only the elites that are accessing these schools, because that's not correct.
It's not only for the elites, but it is overwhelmingly for by far the most privileged people. And you're right, it's not just privileged people from Scotland. There's a significant international cohort here. But you make the point that there's a benefit to the local family from the fishing community. But they would benefit as well if VAT, or they will now benefit from the VAT being paid, because that money goes into the public services that they will disproportionately use far more of than the most privileged families.
I'd love to know what a privileged family is, first of all. I'd love to know what that actually means when I think of the families that attended my school, for example, who I would see as a lawyer, a doctor, a number of people who were working in the public sector and receiving 100 to 80% bursaries, and remembering that, you know, some 2/3 of the bursary pot is paid for by those paying the fees. They're contributing to the outreach work and the opportunity work that's there. So I'm not too sure who these privileged people is. Certainly the schools you refer to there are good examples of a particular way of looking at private and independent schools. And they frustrate people like me, who were in schools that are not like that, and who actually were in schools that are the majority of independent schools in Scotland. And from that point of view, that viewpoint doesn't really help the understanding of the sector, and maybe some of that is our fault in terms of not, you know, raising our head enough and saying a few things. But I'm concerned about that we would see it as, you know, I think for this committee, one great thing this committee could do, because one question I'm constantly wanting an answer to is, and I think this committee, it would be really valuable, and you'd probably be the first to do it. I would love to know what has been, in the past year, what has been the material benefit to children and young people in education in Scotland of VAT on independent school fees? What has been the material benefit? Because there should be a material benefit, because it's taxpayers' money and there should be some accountability. And if that money is being used to help children in schools, great. But I'd love to know if somebody could give me a figure on that, because any time we approach government around any matter, we get the same letter you got. That's what we get.
I mean, well, part of that is because that's just not how public finances work. So the money is not hypothecated like that. But you could pick out any one of a number of new interventions that have been made that disproportionately benefit the most vulnerable children in our society and are roughly cost equivalent to the money that's been recouped through this VAT. You could, for example, if you're saying in the last year, I think it was an additional £15 million of ring-fenced money that went into ASN staffing within the state sector in the last year. So you could pick any one of these examples and say this is roughly cost equivalent. And that would be legitimate. But on your point there, John, about what is privilege, I mean, is your suggestion that the majority of families who send their children to fee-paying schools in Scotland, that they're not privileged?
In terms of no, I wouldn't be contending that. Anyone that sends their child to a good, lives in an affluent area in Scotland and has a professional job might fall into the definition of privilege, whether they send their child to an independent school or to a state school, because their financial circumstances will benefit them in significant ways for those individuals and those young people growing up. So from that point of view, if that's a definition of privilege, that's one I can consent to.
You mentioned there that bursaries. So my understanding is that UK-wide, it's only 1% of the children in fee-paying schools who are on a full bursary. What's the equivalent figure for Scotland? Because I know that bursaries can vary massively from essentially a small discount to 100%. What share of your young people are on a full bursary?
So our schools contribute about £56 million a year in terms of bursaries across Scotland, and we work very closely with Oscar. Our schools work very closely with Oscar. Oscar are really well aware of public benefit in Scotland, and I think our schools have risen to challenges that have been set by Oscar, and they report to them obviously every single year. They expect to see really strong public benefit in our schools, and that is bursaries, and bursaries particularly targeted at rigorously means-tested bursaries. So that we know that those bursaries are absolutely going to the children that are going to benefit from them most and couldn't otherwise attend our schools. And I think, again, Scotland has led the way on having a lot of rigour around bursaries and how they're administrated.
Is it about... Sorry, Catherine, were you... No. Is it about equivalent to the UK-wide figure, or is it?
It's higher.
So how are we talking? 2-3% higher, or 10-15%?
It's what was interesting, and Oscar's work here has been critical here, is when you looked at the context in England in terms of average bursary as a percentage, Scotland was at least 3% above that on average. Okay, why? Because of Oscar and the nature of Oscar. And the requirements here in Scotland around public benefit in comparison to the legislation as it factors in England. And I can only talk from my own school. We would float around the 10 to 11%, and the vast majority of those were full bursaries, 100% bursaries in those contexts. And that's from a very finite pot, as you'll understand. And therefore, in that pot, 2/3 of the finance, or close to 2/3 of that finance, is actually coming from the fees that are coming in on an annual basis. So that's how that operates. And hence why it has to be means tested and it has to be rigorous for fairness around the whole system. Obviously, never mind Oscar and compliance and so forth. But the other aspect is you're very conscious when you're making those decisions that you're using full fee payers' money to help facilitate that as well. So there is I'm an educationalist, so I'm quite moral, and I think about these ethical things as well in making those decisions as well. So that's a factor. But certainly, Oscar is seen as a very positive factor in Scotland, and certainly amongst independent schools, and therefore our playing field is a higher playing field, and quite rightly too.
You mentioned, I think a couple of times earlier on, the previous decision in Scotland that you don't believe the UK government took into account that around non-domestic rates relief and charity relief. That brought back to mind a debate that I had with your predecessor, Lorraine, with John on Radio Scotland about this. Has the sector reflected on the fact that a lot of the warnings it made at the time about that just didn't materialise? Like, and this is where I'm struggling with. I get you are able, at this point, given that this policy has now been implemented for a bit of time, you are able to come to us and show a reduction in your role, etc. But a lot of your projections, like 20% projection, when I think about the extent to which I'm going to put weight on that, because that would be a significant impact, I think back to the debates that I had with John Edward, where claims were made about the catastrophic impact that was going to come to your sector as a result of the NDR changes. That didn't really happen.
I think it's part of the picture, so it's going to be really difficult, I think, ever to look back and go, what proportion of the shrinkage in the sector was down to VAT, what proportion of it was down to that we saw increases in teacher pay and pensions that we had to keep pace with, how much of it was down to non-domestic rates relief, how much of it was down to having, I think, a very credible charity regulator in Scotland saying, no, you must continue to do proper bursaries and proper bursaries out your income at this level. So I suppose why we're slightly frustrated is that we feel we've tried really, really hard in Scotland to do all the right things and to try and be an open, engaging, inclusive sector. Yes, not everybody's always going to be able to afford our fees, but that's why we set up an Education and Partnership Committee. That's why John and I met with Oscar last month to say, what more can we do? How can we build on this? And we're also quite keen to it not just being seen through bursaries, because as John was talking about the FIDA dollar example, working with multiple state schools and 70,000 children. So through a bursary, you can impact a life, but you've all got constituents made up of thousands and thousands of children. So how can we as a sector touch the lives of not just the one or two or the few that get through the bursary criteria? How can we touch the lives of more children in Scotland as a sector by working with the Parliament, by working with this committee to do more of the really good stuff? Because yes, while today we're concentrating on VAT and fees and how that's been harmful, and it has, and how we said it would be, we are as committed and more committed. And if you think of those debates, non-domestic rates and VAT, what we want to come out of these debates is actually how we can move forward and contribute more for all children in Scotland.
I'm very conscious of time. I would love to have a wider discussion with you about that point, because I do think that is a really contested space about the net impact of private fee-paying education in Scotland. And I would obviously come at it from a different perspective from yourselves, but I think it's a helpful discussion to have. I'm just conscious we probably don't have time for that this morning. So just one final question, because it goes back to a point, I think, John, in particular, you mentioned it around the parents' choice and not inflicting harm on children as a result of choices made by others. There's a fair argument in there, but ultimately, is the underlying philosophy of your sector that parents should be allowed to make choices. But as adults, we make choices recognising that there are risks attached to any choice that you make. And if you as a parent choose to send your children into a form of education that is dependent on ability to pay, when the alternative is state school, and I recognise there'll be some for whom that alternative hasn't worked, but for the vast majority, the alternative is state education that's not dependent on your life circumstances. The state will continue to educate your child no matter what. If you have chosen to take an alternate path, do you as a parent not need to just accept that there are risks attached to that? Circumstances can change.
You have to accept there's going to be risk, because there's risk in any decision, although unfortunately economically none of us behave how we're supposed to behave, as we all know. Otherwise it would all be wonderful. Unfortunately, it's not how we behave. But I would argue fundamentally that the comments I was making in that space, in that area, relate significantly to the approach of implementation. Let's say we decide, we don't want, back to Lorraine's point here, I'm more interested in the future, to be absolutely frank with you, Ross, 100% more interested in the future and what we can do and what we're already doing and how we can build on that. And maybe this debate helps to open up some conversations in that space. But I suppose the point I was making there is that if that was coming in, it's coming in. Fine. And those risks and the consequences and so forth. So when assisted places when the Blair government, for example, were removing assisted places, and there was very strong, good arguments around that too. But when they were doing that, there was a plan. And there was a plan that took account of children. That's really what my point was in that context. So if the UK government and the electorate and so forth decide that VAT is the right thing to do, fine, I'm not going to, I may have a different view on that, but that's democracy and we move forward. So then let's take the interests of who's going to be impacted upon this and how can we best support those who are going to be impacted. And that is the frustration. So, for example, even, and hence why I used the business rates example, because the business rates, and I know some of it was delayed for other reasons as well, but those delays, nevertheless, those delays allowed planning, okay, that stopped anything significant happening. And that's fundamentally what I would love to have seen in this case. My view was, it's coming, fine, it's happening, it's coming. My view was, from July onwards, this is coming. Okay, so let's start looking at but we don't know as a school how much we can absorb and not absorb it, etc., etc. Okay, so there's all those factors. But if they had delayed it and still brought it in, or if they had delayed it over a period of time or different percentages, then there's other ways of doing it that would have helped those children that I was commenting on. And that's where I see it. I'm not seeing it as to suggest that, it shouldn't have happened or whatever. If it was happening, fine. I would just have loved the UK government to actually plan what they were doing and to engage. And sadly, and back to the convener's earlier opening remarks, in fact, one of the biggest frustrations has been that the UK government goes out and speaks and warms up with business and various other things. At no point was there any discussion or engagement with the independent sector. There was a huge number of assumptions made through particular lenses, and decisions then were made off the back of that. And we then had to pick up the pieces from that, and that's been a frustrating time. However, if it gives us one thing, it gives us an opportunity to start talking about education and what we can contribute going forward, and what our schools already do and can contribute to, and what we learn. And the appetite, I have to say, in my engagements with SLS, the appetite has been excellent and encouraging to see. And if that's a big silver lining from that, that's a wonderful silver lining for Scottish children. That's how we should look on it.
That's a very good point to end on, because I agree with you absolutely on that point. I support the policy, clearly.
Yeah.
I cannot for the life of me understand why there wasn't a managed transition and engagement with you. That's just the bit boggles my mind. Don't get it. So I agree with you, and you have every sympathy from me on that point, which is probably a good place to
it's a very good place to be. I'll take that, Ross. I'll take that.
This has a supplementary on Mr Greer's points.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I wanted to just ask in terms of impact on bursaries, if there's any anecdotal evidence in terms of reduction going forward. And you just have to look sometimes at Scottish rugby team, the individuals who are getting to the Commonwealth Games, to the Olympics, individuals who are studying music. That access to specialist training in Scotland often relies on bursaries. And so just wondered whether or not there's any work. All of us have touched upon early days of this policy, but what that will have an impact on the nation, on sports stars, being able to access training, etc., going forward.
We're 100% committed to maintaining bursary provision and making sure that there's continuity around that. For families who are on partial bursaries, maybe even just having to find 10% of the school fee to enable them to take up those kind of places that you're talking about. If that 10% was a very modest contribution and then you've got another 20% on that on top of it, those are the families that sadly might not actually even be in a position to be able to take up a very, very, very generous bursary offer. Have you got anything else you want to add?
I think it's important all I would share is that bursaries are in the DNA of many of our schools, pre-Oscar, etc. It's part and parcel of what we're about. And certainly the requirement for in continuing our bursaries is vital. What I would say is that the finite pot that each school has on an annual basis for the allocation of bursaries whilst not affected obviously by VAT in that context, nevertheless, the other inflationary pressures over the years and more children requiring 100% or 95, 80, those kind of numbers, means that arguably fewer children are accessing from the same amount of money, basically. So that's a factor.
Conversation with Scottish Government over a potential different model around this in the future for individuals, especially when we're looking at specialist training and availability, and sometimes that not being in parts of the country where really talented individual sports stars of tomorrow are, and then what that will look like going forward, or is it, again, early days over what that could potentially look like?
We have very regular meetings with Scottish Government officials. I have raised concerns around bursary provision with them, and we've met with Oscar and we've talked about the value of the partnerships being taken into account in a greater degree than they are at the moment. But now that you've raised it as a question, Miles, I will be writing to the Scottish Government this afternoon to suggest that. A very good idea. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener.
On that, or can I take Paul O'Kane and then George Adam? Paul O'Kane.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. Much of my line of questioning Ross Greer has covered, as you perhaps would expect. I am interested, though, in the comparison this morning has been made between England and Scotland, and I suppose the contention that Scotland is not the same as England in terms of you mentioned Eton and Harrow in particular. I mean, on reflection, would you accept that that's perhaps not a helpful comparison, just given what Mr O'Neill had said about trying to communicate better, perhaps, the nature of the sector in Scotland? And given what we heard some of from Mr Greer, that there are clearly schools in the independent sector in Scotland that you could compare very directly to places like Eton and Harrow in terms of their fees. In a fee comparison, do you have that sort of information readily available? Have you done a comparator that would prove your point that you don't feel that the Scottish sector is the same as England? Would be my first question. And just any reflection on that wider communication point that Mr O'Neill made.
I think the data that SCIS has got on school rolls shows us very clearly that our schools have not withstood the shock of VAT coming in overnight in the way that some older establishments with different finances have withstood it in terms of their school rolls. So I think there's data really clearly just within the first year of this policy that this has had a disproportionate impact on our schools and on Scotland. It's really clear to see, Paul.
Accept that a comparison can be made between individual schools in England and individual schools in Scotland in terms of, for example, the fees that are charged on a termly basis would be similar at Eton as to Gordonston, for example.
I think the whole history of Eton, etc. So that we don't have that history in Scotland in terms of this. So these schools have got enormous reserves and are able to do things that actually, when you're talking about fees coming in, that literally is what the school has in a lot of the cases of Scottish schools. So it's not a direct comparison.
Just in terms of history, do you mean the financial history?
The financial history, the length of it, the fact of how they were set up, the different bequests, etc. that they get, very different to some of the schools and the majority of the schools that are in the independent sector in Scotland. So I think that is why it's difficult, and I agree that perhaps it has been that the sector has not explained itself properly and hasn't actually articulated what it looks like in Scotland, and that it is different. And that I suppose the ethos, the approach as well, in terms of really trying to be engaged with communities, there's a lot goes on and we don't talk about it, and it therefore is seen as, it's for the elites. That's a very easy thing to say, very different. And we do think it's a good comparison to say they're not like Eton, Harrow or Winchester. They definitely are not the majority of schools that are in Scotland in the sector.
Sure. But you would accept that, because you talked about bequests and the history. There is a history to schools like Gordonston and Fettes in terms of bequests, in terms of the fact that, Gordonston, for example, can run a summer camp to the tune of £6,750 per person attending to supplement their income.
So that summer camp is predominantly international families who are coming into Scotland. And
to the benefit of Gordonston?
To the benefit of the Murray community and those suppliers that we talked about earlier. So there is money coming in internationally there, and boosting Scotland's reputation as an attractive place to
I
have
absolutely
education.
respect that, and I don't want to fall foul of the convener whose community it is, and it obviously benefits the community. But at the end of the day, that money goes to Gordonstoun as a school and as a business.
And bursaries and the voluntary work that they carry out in the local community as well, and to the local suppliers.
I'm not denying any of that. I'm just saying, as a business, so they make a profit from those activities. Or it adds to their
Gordonstoun's
profit
a charity, so any surplus it makes will be modest.
So that's perhaps a
go back
better
into
description.
education.
Sorry, it's surplus. Forgive me, but it goes to their surplus. I think it's fair to say, in part.
And, surpluses are not something that our schools are particularly talking about at the moment, particularly as a result of all the inflationary pressures that we've set out this morning.
Thank you. No, and useful. I just think it's useful for the context for me to understand and the bigger
Paul,
picture.
we'd be delighted, because I know you're new in post, so we'd be absolutely delighted to arrange some visits to schools in the West for you, where you can see some of this.
Sure. Well, you've helpfully moved me on to, I think you've referenced Cedars a number of times this morning. I think at one point you said that probably nobody knew about Cedars. Obviously, I've represented West Scotland for 5 years, so have been aware of the issues at Cedars. Would you accept that Cedars had financial difficulties prior to the VAT policy coming into place?
So there's, of course, if you've had domestic rates coming in, if you've had huge inflationary pressures with most of the fixed costs in our schools can't do anything about. Their staffing costs, they're mainly teacher pay and pensions, and those have increased significantly. So schools that were small, that were operating at margins because they are charities and don't exist to generate surpluses, there were schools that have really, really struggled with those huge inflationary pressures. And our point was, there might be schools in some parts of the country that if you introduce 20% VAT and fees, those schools, because they've got big historic reserves, can cope with that shock, and their families can cope with that shock because they're from a different financial demographic. But it's the families that were at that school, and it's that kind of school that was just operating at the margins that just couldn't take yet another shock.
But would you, Cedars was struggling to attract pupils. I think that was one of the problems. So there were 75 pupils, I think, in 2023 at a capacity of 120. There were a number of issues over many years, which I won't go into, but, there were clearly financial issues. There was, the church, as I understand, were largely subsidising much of the work of the school. So I suppose, would your view be that Cedars would still be here if it wasn't for 20% VAT? I mean, is that the contention?
As I said earlier, I don't think we'll ever be able to work out the portion of what was it VAT that tipped it over the edge. Was it actually the teacher pay and pension? Was it the non-domestic rates relief? Was it the fact that fees got to a point that not enough people found their offer something that they could access in that general locality? Don't know for sure. So we're not going to make claims about that school closed because of VAT. VAT is a pressure too much for those kind of schools, but you're correct in that there has been a build-up of things, and that's impacted on the number of people who might have wanted to send their children to that school but then couldn't send their child to that school.
And would that be true of Kilgraston as well? Obviously, I'm not a fay into the direct, so I know colleagues will have better knowledge than I, but would you say that was a similar issue?
Say it's
issues, if you like, that.
So, but the point surely is that there may be certain schools where the margins, for most independent schools, first of all, the margins on an annual basis are very, very narrow and have to be narrow because of charitable aspect, but critically also affordability and maintaining it. And shocks to certain schools at certain times, and there's many an independent school has had to close its doors at different times in history because we had that, for example, when City to Places went and there was a lot of mergers and so forth. So certain schools will be more close to that margin that's going to tip them than other schools. That much I would certainly accept, but I wouldn't take the view that certain schools may have closed, and therefore those schools closing means everyone else can get by quite easily and move on, because that's just not the case, because people are losing jobs. We're coming out of the almost vast majority of independent schools will not be participating in SSPA, for example. Now, if you take the 7%, roughly, about 7% of all teachers in Scotland taught in the independent sector, and those were paying into the pension scheme, and fewer now are in schools that are paying into that, and that's real money, that's actual real money going into that scheme. So there's other consequentials there as well, and I would always look at it from that point of view.
Okay, thank you. And just on the feeders issue as well, Lorraine, you had said that the closure of feeders put pressure on state schools in Inverclyde, or that was what I took from your comments. But I recall at the time, I think it was my colleague Martin McCluskey, who's a Member of Parliament, asked Ruth Binks, the Director of Education, directly if there was capacity within Inverclyde schools to support those young people, what the ASN provision would be, and she confirmed that there was indeed capacity within Inverclyde, and indeed there was plans around ASN. So, I mean, would you accept that actually... Or just clarify what you meant by this was the impact?
Absolutely, Paul. I think that's quite important. Absolutely accept in every single local authority area in Scotland, there is capacity. So if one of our schools closes, there is capacity within the local authority. But as you know, local authorities are rather large geographical areas, and there is definitely not always capacity in the local state school where they would have continuity of at least being educated, because local schools should be a local provision. So there's not necessarily capacity where it's needed. There's not necessarily capacity within the correct year groups. There's not continuity of subject choices, so really disruptive for the children. And when I speak to head teachers in the state sector, what they worry about is if a school were to close and suddenly they got a phone call to say, can you educate X hundred of children? No, they can't. So yes, capacity, but capacity at local authority level does not help families that need a place in their local state school. And I don't accept there's places in the local state schools where the demand already is and is going to be in future. Definitely not.
Okay, thank you. I'm very grateful, Convener. I have apologised to Convener that I will need to leave committee early. That's not a reflection on anyone's evidence, and I'm very happy to take Lorraine's offer of a further conversation. I think this has been useful, so grateful.
George Adam.
I take it totally to heart that he's leaving and it's my question now, you know, it's offensive. But basically, those of us, I wasn't going to ask a question this morning, but those of us that come from certain areas, it would be dead easy for us to have a go at independent schools, because A, there's not one in our area, and B, we don't think it affects us to that extent. But when I was listening to some of the questions you had with Ross, particularly yourself, John, when you were talking about the bursaries, because in an area like mine, in Paisley, you would probably end up, there may be, because of demography, some of the children and their families will be, can I either get 100% bursary or will be in various schools getting a bursary of some kind. And I don't know if you answered the question with Ross. I might have faded out at that point, but it was possibly the percentage of national.
I couldn't give you the percentage for the whole of Glasgow. We would have to look at our SCIS data for that, and we could certainly get back to you.
Could we get that data? Because you said I heard the 10% figure from your own school.
Exactly.
It would be national and maybe, if possible, broken down to local authority area. Because I think that brings other people into the conversation.
Good point.
Because it actually kind of makes it more relevant to those of us that have got areas that we don't have. Because I think that kind of makes a difference. And that was basically the only question I had, was just to get that. Because this place runs
just
the data.
On that, I mean, certainly schools, you know, we know the postcodes, etc. Where, so in terms of the data, that's something we could certainly do. That's
no, because I'm aware of some constituents with some independent schools because
absolutely
they were shocked when they were told on the area of deprivation, but it qualified them for some form of bursary with some of the schools.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah,
okay, thank you for that.
It'd be helpful for us as well.
Okay. Thank you. We're also joined today by Liz Smith, who's not a member of the committee but has been keen to come along. So we now go to Liz Smith.
Can I just put on the record, Convener, before I ask my questions, that I've been a governor of 2 independent schools previously, and also I am currently doing some unpaid work with the independent school sector and the state sector in relation to outdoor education.
Okay.
Can I just ask Lorraine about the figure you gave? You have 73 schools in Scotland, and you said in your opening comment that there are a third that are offering specialists. Now, that will include music schools and various things. Could you just give us a little information about that third and what the specialist provision actually is?
Yeah, absolutely, Liz. So that third, and they have VAT applied to their fees, but they get that back through local authorities. They're a really interesting grouping of schools which I think are such an important part of the sector in Scotland and of the SCIS family. So, for example, we have East Park School in Glasgow, and that caters for children with severe levels of autism. So most of their children would be non-verbal. We have Harmony School in Balerno, and that is for children who've come from very disruptive backgrounds, and a lot of those children might not have been in any school setting for a number of years, but Harmony work with them really intensively, and it's a really nurturing school, and they are able to get them back into a school environment and learning. We've also just brought in a new member school to SCIS, Rossi, which is just outside Montrose, and that has secure accommodation as part of its provision. So I talk quite a lot about the diversity of the independent sector in Scotland, and I think that's a very useful question that gives us an opportunity to explain why we talk about being a diverse sector, because yes, we do have some of the big name schools that some members of the committee have talked about this morning, but we also have that provision. And as a sector body, we bring all of that experience together. So when we go to government groups or certain public sector bodies or boards, we're able to bring the experience of all of those schools into the public sector environment. And I'm really grateful for how much we get listened to, how much we get heard, and how much that wider experience is valued, because the experience of the staff at East Park dealing with children who are not able to communicate their needs, and how that can translate into how should we be dealing with behaviour in schools, why do kids get distressed, and how can we identify that and how can we better support that. So there's a real wealth of experience in our specialist schools that I think can help not just the wider SCIS family, but really contribute into the wider education system.
That's immensely helpful. I think it is very important to get across that diversity, because I think there's a perception out there sometimes that these schools are nothing to do with SCIS, and yet they are. Can I just ask, in relation to, obviously the level of additional support needs is increasing across the board. Is there any indication that within these specialist schools that SCIS looks after, that there is any financial impact on pupils who might like to go there?
No, because
they get
pupils,
the VAT back.
For us to be admitted to a specialist school, there would need to be a local authority assessment, and it would be the local authority in the main that would place children, because they're children with very high level needs that the local authority said could not go into a mainstream setting.
So the concern about potential difficulties facing ASN pupils is not in that third of these schools. That's in the 2/3 that you're looking after. I've had representations from 3 different parents across Perthshire, one of whom gave me permission to say this, that they have a very severely dyslexic child. Thanks to the independent school that he was attending, they got very considerable specialist help, one-to-one. And because of the VAT, they're no longer able to go to that school. Gone to a state school, and they say, and they would want me to say this, despite the best efforts of the staff in that school, there is not the specialist provision. And that youngster is suffering both academically and socially, and they're at their wits' end about what to do. Can I just ask, is that coming back to SCIS quite a bit in terms of those who are facing financial constraints?
It is, because those are the ones that hadn't planned to. We want an independent education. The families that have come to the realisation that they need more than they're currently getting, or not need more, but need something different. And have accessed something different, and it is really particularly traumatic for those children if they got to a point where their anxiety levels reduce because they're being supported and they're able to flourish, and then that's taken away from them, and taken away from them overnight, which is why, had there been more planning about the policy, and if that planning had actually focused not on big name institutions and perceptions around those, but had actually focused on the children and young people who were going to be implemented in the short term in the policy, I think we would have arrived at a different scenario than the one we're facing.
I think these parents would agree with that. They said that the local authority had been reasonably supportive, but they just didn't have the capacity to look after this youngster's needs. And I think, just go back to the comments that Mr. Rennie made, it's about ensuring that we can provide for all these youngsters without disruption in the other area. Can I come to the issue of bursary support? Because I know this is very complex, and I know we've had various discussions around the committee table earlier. Is it the case that of those schools who do offer substantial bursary support, that the numbers who are offering 100% bursaries is starting to decrease? Is that correct? Mr. O'Neill, you mentioned this.
I think the way we would put it is that the number of 100% bursaries, or 95% and 100%, because some schools have views on whether it's 100% or not, the number of where that pot has been spent is really my point. The pot, because of all the inflationary factors, and I appreciate that's not one of them in this context, means that that pot is covering fewer children. That's how I would phrase it. That's certainly evident. That's the case. You can see that quite clearly happening. So that therein, and that also goes back to the fact that schools, many schools don't have the reserves in terms of bequests, whatever it may be, to draw on within their bursary, and therefore pressure on fees and the impact that has on numbers coming through means that pot has been squeezed as well.
And do you think that in the longer run, apart from the obvious impact that there will be a reduction in the number of pupils in the independent sector, do you think there could be a further reduction because of a potential reduction in the number of bursaries giving good support? So that's an added problem for
this. What's really interesting is if you look at the numbers applying for bursaries over the last 10 years has increased. Some of that is because certain income brackets have obviously changed. The nurse and the policeman and such like that used to send and pay full fees are not in that kind of context because of all the different pressures. So there's been an increase there in terms of bursary requirement. At the same time, so there's still an interest. There are still people choosing if we can get this. However, the finances are in a position where fewer, and I would agree with your point therefore, that going forward fewer will be able to access that. But it's not a case of a school saying to itself, well, we're having to pay VAT on fees and such. Well, our parents are having to do that. We're no longer interested in that. It's within the DNA of it. It's just you're not able, and it's a horrible position to be in, of course, when you're making those decisions. But there's fewer and fewer children going to benefit from it. There's no doubt.
Be that if that is the case, would that have implications for the diversity of that pupil intake in that school? Because you would have fewer people applying, so that demographically for that specific school would have a considerable difference, which presumably is not what we would want to see.
That's not what you're wanting, and that's one of the great huge educational benefits, within a school of bursaries as well. So even as an educationalist, if I was just sitting and looking at it as an educationalist, the mixed diversity within the school is what's going to bring out the best in each child within that school setting, and where that's been diminished or affected in some way, then there will be consequences.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just finally from me, the current UK Labour government have U-turned on many policies. They don't look like they're U-turning on this one. So short of a full U-turn, is there anything they can provide or offer to assist independent schools in Scotland?
That's a very, very good question. I think
well,
I mean, I think they have done a huge amount of harm, not just to independent schools in Scotland, but to Scottish education, with a policy that didn't completely didn't even begin to understand our position and the diverse nature of our sector. I think, Convener, what would be really helpful is if there's anything the committee thinks it can do to help us realise the real potential that there is in the sector to impact on the lives of all children in Scotland, not just those that are currently in our schools. We'd be really keen to take forward that discussion. But for now, I think they have done the damage.
Well, I think on that discussion, your attendance here today has helped that. Myself and others are choosing not to come back. Others may not be allowed to come back given the results of the election, but it's certainly something I think a successor committee will be able to look at should they wish, and your attendance and evidence today will help them decide a future course of action. So can I thank you all for your time today and the evidence you provided, not just for SCIS but on behalf of independent schools and indeed schools in the state sector as well. It is much appreciated, and I now formally close this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.